I never planned to spend a night alone that far into the mountains, but I told myself that a few days of quiet would help clear my head after months of non-stop work. I chose a small wooden cabin near the North Ridge in western Montana, a place built sometime in the late 1970s, surrounded by thick pines and long stretches of untouched land. I had always liked silence, but the kind of silence that waited for me out there was nothing like the city kind. It felt heavier, almost like it pressed against my skin. The cabin sat about half a mile off a dirt road that barely looked like a road anymore. The ground had dried into wide cracks, and loose gravel rolled under my boots with each step. When I first reached the cabin, the air smelled like pine sap and cold soil. The wood on the outside walls looked sun-bitten and rough, with long lines of dried rain stains running down the planks. The windows were small, the kind that let light in but kept everything else out. I liked that. I wanted something simple. Inside, the place smelled like old dust, dried wood, and something faintly metallic, like nails that had rusted a long time ago. The floorboards creaked at every step, but that was normal for older cabins. The kitchen was tiny, just a sink, a wooden counter, and an old propane stove that looked older than me. A narrow hallway led to a small bedroom with a single bed and a dresser missing 2 drawers. There was a back door too, one that opened to a small clearing that looked flattened by years of wind. For most of the first day, everything felt normal. I unpacked my things, cooked a simple meal, and watched the sun drop behind the tall trees. The light faded fast that deep in the woods, and the temperature dropped even faster. By the time it was fully dark, the air felt colder than I expected, and each breath came out faint and white. I tried to relax, but the silence grew strange. It wasn't that there was no sound. There were the normal forest noises, like the clicking of insects or the distant rustle of branches, but every sound felt sharper, like it came from too close. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I just wasn't used to being that deep in the wilderness. Around midnight, the wind lifted. It moved through the trees in long waves, and the cabin's wooden frame made little cracking sounds as if the cold air squeezed it. I had been lying on the bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to fall asleep. That was when I heard it. Something soft, like a slow step on the gravel outside the cabin. At first I thought I imagined it, but then I heard it again. Not heavy, but very real. A slow, dragging step. I tightened my breath and stayed still. I had seen tracks earlier in the day, so I told myself it was probably a deer or an elk moving close to the cabin. The mountains were full of them, but something felt wrong. The steps were too controlled, too careful. I stayed in the bed, staring at the dark ceiling while the sound stopped, then started again, closer to the side of the cabin. I pictured someone walking slowly around the outside walls. My chest tightened so much that I had to remind myself to breathe. I reached for the small flashlight I brought and held it tight, as if it could protect me from anything. Minutes passed, maybe longer. The steps faded, but the feeling in my gut didn't leave. Eventually, I sat up and stayed awake until the weak morning light showed through the window. By the next day, I tried to act normal. I walked a bit near the ridge, tried to focus on the view of the valley, tried to convince myself I had just imagined things. But when I walked behind the cabin, something froze me in place. There were marks in the dirt. Long, thin tread marks, not from any animal I knew. They looked like the impressions from the bottom of a shoe. One pair, deep, fresh. I felt a wave of cold move through me, colder than the air. Someone had been behind the cabin the night before. The rest of the day passed with a tightness in my chest that refused to leave. I kept looking at the tree line, expecting someone to walk out of it. The wind didn't help either. Every time a branch snapped somewhere, my body jumped. When the sun dropped again, the cabin felt even smaller than before. I double-checked the front door latch and pushed one of the heavy chairs against it. I checked the back door twice. The sky outside turned so dark that it looked like the forest swallowed all the light. It must have been around 1 in the morning when the sound came again. This time closer, more decisive. A slow step on the gravel, then another, then another. My body went cold. The back door creaked faintly, not from being touched but from the wind pushing against it. Then something brushed against the wall. I felt it more than I heard it. a soft drag of a hand or a sleeve against the wooden boards. I held my breath so long that my chest burned. My heart thudded loud enough that I thought whoever was out there could hear it. The steps moved slowly toward the side of the cabin, pausing every few seconds, like whoever it was wanted to listen. The worst part was the moment when the steps reached the window near the bed. I couldn't see anything from my angle, but I felt the presence, the weight of someone standing just on the other side of the thin glass. I stayed frozen, staring into the dark room, afraid to move even a finger. The person stood there for a long time, longer than made any sense. Then the steps began again, this time moving away. Slow, steady, fading into the trees. I didn't sleep at all. I waited until the sky started turning gray, grabbed my backpack, and walked out the front door without cleaning up anything I had brought. I didn't care. I didn't even look back at the cabin. I just kept walking until I reached my car, my hands shaking so much that I dropped the keys twice before starting the engine. I drove down that broken dirt road faster than I should have, and I didn't stop until I reached the first gas station miles away. Only then did I realize how tense my whole body had been. My arms hurt from how tightly I had been holding the steering wheel. I never went back to that cabin. I never even asked the owner about it. I didn't want answers. The woods are full of people who walk paths no one talks about. People who know how to move quietly. People who know how to wait in the dark. All I know is that someone was there that night. Someone who walked slowly around the walls. Someone who stood outside my window without making a sound. Someone who didn't rush, didn't speak, didn't try to hide their steps. They acted like they had all the time in the world. And that was the part that scared me the most. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. It was the summer of 2012, and I was 25, burnt out from another long season of construction work in northern Vermont. I had rented a small cabin in the Green Mountains, about 20 miles from the nearest town, wanting nothing more than silence, fresh air, and the chance to hike without anyone around. The cabin was advertised as rustic but livable, perched on the edge of a dense forest with a small creek running nearby. When I arrived in the late afternoon, the sun hanging low in the sky, I realized just how isolated it truly was. The gravel road that led there twisted through the woods, narrow and overgrown, and I hadn't passed another car for miles. The cabin itself was small, maybe 20 by 20 feet, made of rough-hewn logs. The windows were dusty, the paint peeling off the wooden shutters, and the porch sagged slightly under years of neglect. Inside, it smelled of damp wood and the faint mustiness of disuse. There was a small stove, a fridge that hummed irregularly, and a table with 2 chairs. The bedroom was tiny, with a thin mattress on a metal frame. I set my things down, made a fire in the stove, and stepped outside to watch the sun set over the treetops. The silence was profound, almost overwhelming. No birds called out, no wind stirred, just the faint sound of water trickling over rocks in the creek. The first night passed without incident, though I lay awake longer than usual, feeling an odd tension in my chest. There was no one around for miles, and yet every snap of a branch, every rustle in the leaves, seemed louder than it should have been. By morning, I brushed it off as nerves. The day was spent hiking a nearby trail that led to a small ridge overlooking the valley. The forest was dense, green, and quiet, almost oppressively so. I remember stopping often to catch my breath, to let the calm of the woods fill me. Yet as the day wore on, I noticed strange signs. Broken branches lying in odd patterns, shallow footprints in the mud that weren't mine, and once, the faint glint of something metallic partially hidden under leaves near the creek. I told myself it was probably a hiker who had passed by days ago, but unease had settled in my stomach. That evening, I returned to the cabin and decided to cook dinner. As I chopped vegetables, I heard a loud crack from outside, like a branch snapping under weight. I froze. For a moment, the wind had died completely, and there was only the sound of the stove's weak hum. Then another crack, closer this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps crunching on gravel. My first instinct was to convince myself it was an animal, deer, maybe a raccoon, but the steps were heavy, deliberate. They didn't move like a deer. I checked the doors and windows. All were locked. I sat at the table, knife in hand, my back to the stove and eyes on the door. The steps circled the cabin slowly, stopping sometimes, then moving again. They were quiet enough that I had to strain to hear them, but they were undeniably deliberate. I didn't sleep much that night, and when I did, I dreamed of someone watching from the trees, following me, circling the cabin. The next day, I debated leaving immediately. My car was parked at the bottom of the gravel path, the keys heavy in my pocket. I tried to rationalize everything. Maybe it was just a hiker who had camped nearby. Maybe the sounds were just my imagination amplified by the isolation. I spent the day hiking in a different direction, keeping my eyes open for any signs of people. Around midday, I stumbled upon a small clearing with a second, much older cabin, half collapsed and abandoned. Inside, there were remnants of someone having lived there. An empty tin can, a frayed blanket, and, disturbingly, several pairs of worn shoes lined up against a wall. My stomach turned. I realized that the isolation I had sought was also something that made it easy for someone to remain unseen, living off the grid, watching. By evening, I had packed a small bag with essentials and returned to my cabin to leave before dark. I lit the stove one last time to warm up, then stood at the door, listening. The footsteps returned, soft but persistent, circling just beyond the porch. I felt trapped, like I couldn't leave without being seen. My mind raced. I considered running through the trees to the road, but the terrain was uneven, and I had no idea where the person could be. Then suddenly the footsteps stopped. Complete silence. I didn't breathe. After what felt like an eternity, I opened the door and peeked outside. There was no one. No shadow, no figure, nothing. Just the dense forest and the fading light of dusk. My heart was pounding. I grabbed my bag and, without looking back, ran down the gravel path to my car. Every sound of the forest seemed magnified. The wind rustling leaves, the distant splash of water. But I kept moving, ignoring the fear that was still gnawing at me. I drove straight to the nearest gas station in the nearest town, called the local sheriff, and reported the cabin and the abandoned one I had found. They checked the area and confirmed that people had occasionally been living off the grid, sometimes approaching travelers, sometimes remaining hidden for weeks. I never returned to that part of Vermont, and I never rented a cabin in the woods again. Even now, years later, I remember the way the silence pressed down on me, how the weight of the forest made every small sound feel like a warning. But the experience also taught me something important. Isolation can be both peaceful and dangerous, and no matter how much you prepare, the wild always has a way of reminding you that you're never entirely in control. I didn't plan to spend that weekend alone in the mountains, but life had cornered me into it. I was 31 that year, tired from a job that took more energy than it gave back. A friend had offered me a small cabin in northern Montana, a place he barely used anymore. He called it peaceful. I needed peaceful. I wanted to clear my head, breathe cold air, and hear nothing but wind through trees. The drive up was long and empty, and by the time I reached the gravel road that cut into the woods, the sun was already leaning toward the west. The cabin sat 50 minutes away from the nearest town. It wasn't old, but it wasn't well kept either. The wooden steps sagged a little and the windows needed cleaning. Still, it looked solid and the isolation felt like a relief. Inside, everything smelled like dry wood and old dust. There was a small kitchen, a single bedroom, and a living room with a wood stove. I unpacked slowly, moving through the rooms like someone checking a stranger's pockets. I kept noticing small things: the uneven floor by the door, the faint scratches on the back wall, a single boot print near the window that didn't match mine. I assumed my friend had left it behind on a previous visit. I tried to ignore the small knot forming at the base of my neck. By evening, the temperature dropped fast. I lit the stove, watched the flames catch, and tried to settle into the silence. I made myself a simple dinner and sat by the window to eat. Outside, the forest faded into a dark mass. No lights, no houses, no movement. Just layers of trees pressing against each other. At first, the quiet helped. Then it became too quiet, like the kind where every small noise feels louder than it should. Around midnight, I decided to sleep. The bed was stiff, the mattress uneven. I wrapped myself in 2 blankets, listened to the hum of the stove cooling off, and tried to drift off. For a while, I almost did until I heard something outside. It wasn't dramatic, just slow, heavy steps moving through dead leaves. They were spaced far apart, like someone taking careful, deliberate strides. My body tightened immediately. I told myself it was deer, maybe elk. They were common here, but the steps sounded too controlled, too measured. Animals usually moved with less patience. I stayed still for a long time, barely breathing. The steps came closer. They reached the front porch. I felt the faint vibration of weight pressing onto the wooden plank outside the door. One slow step, then another, then silence. My heart beat so loudly that I could hear it in my ears. I stared at the ceiling, unable to stop imagining someone standing inches from me, with only a thin door between us. I waited for a knock, or the squeak of the doorknob, or anything that made sense. Nothing happened. The porch stayed silent until the cold stiffness of fear slowly wore me out. I must have fallen asleep sometime before dawn. When the morning came, sunlight made everything seem soft and harmless. I almost convinced myself I had imagined it. But when I stepped outside, I saw clear footprints in the dirt. Human footprints, one set, leading from the tree line straight to the porch. They stopped at the door and turned back toward the forest. They weren't mine. I felt my stomach drop. I didn't have good cell coverage, but enough for a single bar if I stood in one specific spot inside the cabin. Even then, calls barely connected. I thought of leaving immediately, but the idea of packing up and driving that narrow mountain road while still half panicked didn't feel safe either. I told myself it was probably a hiker or hunter, someone lost, someone curious, someone with no harmful intention. I kept repeating that until it started sounding true. I stayed another night only because it felt like overreacting to leave. But I prepared differently. I locked every window, even the small one in the bathroom. I pushed a chair under the doorknob. I kept a flashlight and a heavy iron pan beside the bed. I lay there waiting for darkness to do what darkness always does. Turn everything into something else. The wind picked up that night. The trees outside scratched against each other. The cabin creaked slightly as temperature dropped. But beneath all of that, I began hearing something soft. A faint brushing sound came from the back wall of the cabin. First, I thought it was branches rubbing the wood. But branches move in irregular patterns. The sound was rhythmic, slow, like someone pulling their hand lightly along the surface, moving inch by inch. I felt the same tightness in my chest that I felt the night before. I didn't look out the window. I didn't move. I stayed completely still as that brushing shifted from the back wall to the side, then finally to the window near the kitchen. The thin glass vibrated just slightly, like fingers tapping or testing it. I waited for it to break. It never did. After an hour, maybe more, maybe less, the sound faded. I stayed awake until sunrise, eyes open, every muscle tense. The morning was cold and gray. I walked outside again, even though I didn't want to. More footprints. Same size, same shape. They circled the cabin this time. Not fast circles, slow, uneven loops, as if someone was walking around it while thinking. We're watching. They had gotten close to the kitchen window, so close that the dirt showed the mark of toes pressed firmly into the ground. I packed my things without wasting a second. I didn't bother folding clothes or cleaning anything. I shoved everything into my bag and carried it out to the car. I kept looking into the trees, half expecting someone to step out. No one did, but I kept feeling watched. That feeling stayed with me until I reached the main road. When I finally reached town, my phone caught full signal again. I sent my friend a message telling him I wouldn't use the cabin again. I didn't explain why. I didn't want to think about it. I didn't want to describe the footprints or the slow brushing on the walls. I never found out who was out there. Maybe it was a wanderer living off the grid. Maybe it was someone scouting empty cabins for things to steal. Maybe it was something far worse, someone who enjoyed watching people sleep in isolated places. What scared me most wasn't the fact that someone came to the cabin. It was the way they moved. Slow, patient, like they had all the time in the world. Like they knew I was inside and wanted me to know they were there, but not what they wanted. It's been years since that weekend, and I still think about those nights. Not the cabin, not the forest, just the sound of footsteps on dry leaves. Heavy, careful, coming closer, and the quiet way they stood on the porch, knowing I was on the other side of the door, frozen, listening. I learned something real up there. Silence is not peaceful when you're not alone. And I know I wasn't alone. Not those nights. Not by a long shot. It was the winter of 1998 when I decided to take a solo trip to the remote forests of northern Vermont. I had just turned 27, recently out of a stressful job, and I thought some time alone in the wilderness would clear my mind. I found a small cabin for rent, tucked miles away from the nearest town, accessible only by a narrow, snow-packed dirt road. The idea of complete isolation excited me. I wanted silence, fresh air, and the kind of solitude city life never offered. The drive up was long. The sun was already low when I arrived, turning the thick snow drifts into golden sheets. The cabin was older than I expected, built from rough, dark pine logs, with a steep roof and a stone chimney. Smoke curled faintly from it, though the place was advertised as self-heated, which I assumed meant a wood stove. I parked my car on the narrow path leading up to it and carried my bag inside. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of old wood and dampness. Dust motes danced in the fading light coming through small, square windows. The furniture was minimal. A rough wooden table, 2 chairs, a small bed, and a metal stove. There was a pile of firewood in the corner and a bucket with ashes next to the stove. I figured the previous renter had left it behind. The isolation was exactly what I wanted, but I felt a little unnerved, standing alone in a building that hadn't seen visitors in months. The first night, I lit the stove and sat in a chair with a thick blanket. Outside, the wind rattled the windows and moaned through the trees. It wasn't scary at first, just cold and quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears. I tried to read, but my mind kept wandering to the idea of being completely alone in this massive forest. Eventually, the fire burned low, and I fell asleep to the occasional thud of snow falling from the roof or the branches scraping the cabin walls. The second day, I decided to explore the surrounding area. The snow was deep, almost up to my knees in some places. I stumbled across an old logging trail and followed it for hours. The forest felt alive, and at first that was comforting. But as the day wore on, I started noticing strange things. Footprints that weren't mine, the occasional broken branch that looked deliberately snapped, and the feeling of being watched. I brushed it off as paranoia. This was the forest. Animals, wind, the mind playing tricks. That night, I woke to a noise outside. At first, I thought it was an animal, but the sound was deliberate. A slow scraping against the cabin door. My heart hammered in my chest. I grabbed a flashlight and edged toward the door. Through the frosted glass, I could see nothing. The snow was falling gently, erasing footprints and signs, but the sound continued for a while, then stopped. I didn't sleep well that night, sitting up periodically to listen for any movement. The next morning, I found something that froze my blood. Near the back of the cabin, partially hidden in the snow, were tracks. Not animal tracks. Human. They were large, heavy, and walked in a deliberate pattern around the cabin. They didn't continue into the woods. They ended at the tree-line as if whoever had made them had been waiting. I checked my locks, my windows, and my supplies, then sat staring at the wall, trying to convince myself I was overreacting. I decided to leave the next day. I packed methodically, making sure nothing was left behind. But that evening, as I returned from gathering some firewood, I saw something that made my stomach turn. Someone had moved the logs I had stacked neatly by the stove. They were now scattered, with some pieces forming a rough circle. Nothing was broken, nothing stolen, but the intentionality of it was clear. Someone had been inside the cabin while I was out, though there were no signs of forced entry. I spent the night fully awake, knife in hand, the door locked and the windows barricaded as best I could with furniture. The wind outside had picked up, rattling the cabin, but I knew now that the forest itself wasn't the only danger. I could feel the tension pressing against my chest, the weight of being watched and not knowing how close the person might be. Every sound made me jump, every shadow seemed alive. By morning, I had made my decision. Couldn't wait. I drove down the snow-packed trail as fast as I could, eyes scanning constantly for movement. My mind raced with every possible scenario, imagining someone hiding just beyond the tree line. The town I drove into a few hours later felt like a safe haven, every warm light and passing car reassuring me that the nightmare was over. I called the local sheriff and reported the incident. They came with a couple of deputies, scoured the area around the cabin, and found evidence of someone having been inside recently. Footprints, smudges on windows, a partially used candle. But there was no one there, no signs of struggle, no idea who it had been. They suggested it might have been a transient, someone hiding out in the forest, and warned me about staying in remote areas alone. After that, I never went back to the cabin. The memory stayed with me for years. The eerie feeling of being watched, the footprints in the snow, the sense that someone had been inside, unseen, in a place I thought was completely isolated. It taught me that real danger doesn't need ghosts or monsters. It's the quiet, deliberate presence of another human being, watching and waiting. I still think about that winter sometimes, but now, whenever I'm alone in the wilderness, I make sure I'm not as trusting, and I never ignore the small signs. The forest itself hadn't changed, but I had. I had learned the importance of vigilance and preparation, and how quickly isolation could turn into fear. That winter, I walked away unharmed, but more aware, more cautious, and strangely, more alive. I drove up to the mountains in early October of 2019, trying to get a break from the noise of the city. I had taken a week off work after months of stress and late nights, and I wanted nothing more than a quiet place where I could breathe. A friend of mine told me about an old cabin he once rented years ago near a lake in northern Idaho. He didn't remember much about it except that it was cheap, far from people, and the road to it was rough. That was enough for me. I booked it online without thinking too much. The drive took almost 9 hours. My phone lost signal about 2 hours before I reached the gravel road, and from there the trail only got worse. The trees grew closer, the ground got uneven, and the air felt colder even though it was midday. When I finally saw the cabin through the trees, I felt relieved. It stood alone near a clearing, built from dark wood that looked aged but solid enough. A narrow path led toward the lake, and the water shone through the gaps between the trees. Inside, the cabin was small but functional. One room with a bed, a small table, an old stove, and a little bathroom that smelled like damp wood. Everything looked worn, the kind of place that hadn't seen many visitors in years. I unpacked my bags, opened the windows to let fresh air sweep through, and tried to settle in. I planned to stay 4 nights. The first day was calm. I walked down to the lake, watched the water move in slow, gentle waves, and felt my stress slowly lift. The silence felt heavier out there, but not in a bad way. When the sun started going down, I went back inside, cooked a simple meal, and read a book until I got tired. I slept early. The second night things started to feel strange. I woke up around 2 a.m. to a faint creaking sound, as if something had stepped on the porch outside. I lay still, listening. The cabin made noises on its own. Old wood shifting with the cold, wind brushing the walls. But this sound felt different. It had weight, slow, careful. I held my breath without meaning to. I wanted to convince myself it was an animal, maybe a deer. The forest was full of them. After a few minutes, the sound faded, and I eventually fell back asleep. The next morning, I checked the porch. I didn't see anything unusual, only some disturbed leaves that could have been from the wind. I tried not to overthink it and spent the day walking around the woods. The cabin felt older each time I returned to it, like I was noticing things I missed before. The cracked window frame, the scratches on the wooden door, the uneven nails, the faint smell of stale air that didn't go away no matter how long the windows stayed open. That night, the creaking came back, but it was slower, more deliberate. This time it stopped right beside the window near the bed. I didn't move. I stared at the wall and felt my heartbeat pounding in my ears. The sound stayed there, steady, as if something stood right outside, not moving, almost listening. At one point, I thought I heard a soft scrape against the wall. My skin crawled. I didn't check. I stayed frozen until morning light came through the window. When I finally got up, I walked outside with my pulse still heavy. On the ground below the window, the dirt looked disturbed, flattened in a shape that didn't match any animal track I recognized. It was almost like a footprint, but wider and less clear, as if someone stepped there days ago and it had only partly held its shape. I kept trying to think of a sensible explanation, but none made me feel better. By the third night, the fear had built up so much that I didn't want to sleep. I kept the lantern on, even though it faded every few hours. The wind outside was loud, pushing against the trees, making them sway and groan. I tried reading, but my eyes kept flicking toward the door, then the windows, then the corners of the room where the light didn't reach properly. Around midnight, I heard it again. But this time, the steps weren't outside. They were on the side of the cabin where the bathroom was. Slow, like before, but heavier, almost dragging. The sound moved along the wall. I stared at the bathroom door, waiting. Then a thud, a single dull hit, like something leaned or pressed against the wood from the outside. I felt my hands shake. My throat went dry. Every instinct told me not to move, not to breathe, not to let it know I was awake. The thud came again, softer the second time. Then everything went still. The kind of stillness that hurts your ears because you're waiting for something to break it. Minutes passed, then an hour. I didn't sleep at all that night. When the first light of morning touched the cabin floor, I grabbed my jacket and walked around to the bathroom wall. The ground near it looked disturbed again, more clearly this time. The dirt had a deep groove, like something had dug its heel in or leaned against the wall with force. There were also faint drag lines, as if something had knelt or crouched there. My stomach twisted. For the first time, I thought about leaving early, but the road was long and rough, and I didn't want to drive it while exhausted. I decided I would leave the next morning instead of staying the full week. I spent the whole day inside, packing my things, keeping the blinds down, trying to make as little noise as possible. I kept imagining footsteps coming toward the house, something standing right outside the door, something watching the windows. The cabin felt smaller by the hour. Every sound made me twitch, the groan of the roof, the tap of pine needles falling onto the porch, the movement of branches against each other. When night came, I didn't turn off the light. I sat on the bed with my bags next to me, fully dressed, ready to run outside if I had to. The darkness outside the windows felt thick, almost like it pressed against the glass. Time moved painfully slow. Around 3 a.m., I heard it again. This time, the steps were not cautious or slow. They were steady, direct, moving toward the front porch. The boards creaked under the weight. One step, then another, then another. My chest felt tight. I didn't blink. The air felt colder, like someone had opened the door even though it was shut. The steps stopped right at the door. Then nothing, just silence. Deep, heavy silence. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the door, waiting for the handle to move, waiting for the porch to creak again. But nothing happened. Not another sound. When dawn finally came, I opened the door and stepped outside with my heart pounding. The porch boards had fresh marks, dirt, leaves, and something like the faint outline of a shoe, but distorted, like whoever stepped there had worn something uneven or broken. The marks faced the door, like someone had stood there for a long time, watching, listening. That was enough. I didn't check the rest of the property. I threw my bags in the car, started the engine, and drove down the rough path without looking back. My hands shook the entire way down the mountain. I didn't breathe normally until I reached a paved road and saw the first signal bars return to my phone. I never learned who or what was outside the cabin. There were no news stories later, no reports of a person in the woods, nothing that explained the steps, the scraping, the marks in the dirt, the long silent hours when something stood only feet away from me. But I know what I heard. I know what I felt. And I know that someone was out there, close enough to touch the wall beside where I slept, close enough to stand at the door for hours in total darkness. I have never gone back to any cabin since then, and I never will. I was 33 years old the year I decided to spend a week alone in a small wooden cabin deep inside the forests of northern Montana. It was the autumn of 2017, the season when the trees turn a deep gold and the nights drop fast and cold. I had rented the place from an older man I barely met. He only gave me a rough direction and told me I would not see any other houses for miles. I wanted quiet, I wanted space, and I wanted a break from everything in my life that felt too loud. At first, the silence felt like a gift, but by the third night, it became something else entirely. The cabin sat on a small rise above a long slope of pine trees. It had one room, a tiny bathroom, and a narrow porch with old boards that bent a little when I stepped on them. Inside, everything smelled like old wood, dust, and the faint chemical scent of the propane heater. The first 2 days were calm. I chopped some firewood, took long walks along a dried creek bed, and listened to the wind move through the tall trees. Nothing felt wrong yet. It was the kind of quiet that feels clean. But on the third evening, just as the last light faded from the sky, I heard something far down the slope, something heavy moving through the trees. Not fast, slow. Too slow for an animal that size. At first I thought it might be an elk, but the steps had a strange rhythm. A pause, a slow drag, another pause, then a few more heavy steps. It stopped for so long that I almost convinced myself I imagined it. When I went to bed that night, I tried not to think about the sound, but it stayed stuck in my head as I lay there staring at the dark ceiling. The next morning, the air felt different. There was a strong smell of damp earth drifting through the small window, as if the forest had been overturned during the night. When I stepped outside, I noticed something that made me stop. Deep tracks in the soft soil on the hill below the porch. They were not animal tracks. They looked like footprints, but wider, heavier, and uneven, like someone limping or dragging one leg. The soil was torn up in strange places, as if whoever it was had stumbled or dropped something heavy. I felt a strong, sharp fear rise in my chest, but I tried to steady myself. I told myself they could belong to a hunter or someone hiking in the area. But I had walked that whole slope on my first day, and I remembered how empty it felt. The nearest road was miles away. The trees there were so thick that moving through them would be hard for anyone, especially someone walking like that. I tried to calm myself by keeping busy. I collected more firewood, boiled water for coffee, and forced myself to read a book I brought. But every little noise made me look up. The wind brushing against the window made my stomach tighten. A bird landing on the roof made me nearly spill my drink. I felt watched, even though there was no reason I should feel that way. By the time the sun set, I was already tense. I kept hearing faint cracks in the woods, but they were so far away I couldn't be sure if they were real or if I was imagining them. When darkness finally covered the cabin, the forest became something else. Every sound grew louder. Every shift in the wood, every groan of the floor felt like a warning. Around midnight, I woke up to a thud against the far wall of the cabin. A single heavy thud, like something had leaned or slammed into the outside wall. My chest tightened so hard I could feel my heartbeat in my teeth. I stayed perfectly still on the bed, breathing shallow, trying to hear anything else. The cabin was silent for a long moment. Then came another sound. Another slow drag across the leaves just outside the window. Not footsteps, more like something pulling weight behind it. I didn't move for what felt like an hour. I just lay there frozen, listening to the forest. I told myself not to panic, but fear kept spreading through me in waves. Eventually, the sounds faded, and I stayed awake until dawn, unable to close my eyes again. When morning came, my hands were shaking as I opened the door. The air outside was cold, sharp, and strangely still. I walked slowly around the cabin, forcing myself to look. On the back wall, in the thin layer of dirt and pine needles pressed against the wood, I saw a long smear, like someone had dragged their hand or arm along the surface. Below it were marks where the leaves and soil had been pushed aside by something heavy. I felt something inside me shift then, something that told me I needed to leave. I tried to think clearly, but the fear kept making my thoughts skip. I told myself to pack up and go back to my car, even though it was over a mile down a narrow trail. I didn't want to walk through the woods alone, but staying in the cabin felt worse. By afternoon, the sky grew darker than it should have been, as if a storm was building. I packed my bag, grabbed the small hatchet I had used for firewood, and kept it close. Every minute felt stretched and tight. I kept checking the slope, looking for movement. Once, I thought I saw something shift between the trees far down the hill, a shape too tall to be an animal, but when I blinked it was gone. When evening came, I made my final decision. I would leave at sunrise. I didn't want to walk the trail in the dark, and I didn't want to run blindly into the forest either. I kept every light in the cabin on that night, even though the bulbs were dim and yellow. I sat on the floor with my back against the bed, holding the hatchet, listening to the wind. The forest stayed quiet for hours, so quiet it made me more nervous. Silence can feel loud when you are waiting for something to happen. I watched the small window until my vision blurred. I kept thinking about those tracks, that strange dragging sound, and the smear on the wall. I kept trying to tell myself it could all be explained, but the truth sat heavy in my chest. I didn't believe any normal explanation anymore. It was close to 3 a.m. when I heard it again. Not a thud this time, not dragging, but breathing. Slow, steady breathing just outside the wall. Too close. I could hear it through the thin wood. My whole body locked up so fast it hurt. I didn't move even a finger. The breathing stayed there for a long time, as if whoever it was stood still, listening for movement inside. At one point, the soft crunch of leaves shifted near the window, and I could tell the person, or whatever it was trying to look inside. I held the hatchet so tightly my knuckles felt like they would tear through my skin. I stayed silent, barely even letting air out of my lungs. After a long stretch of stillness, the breathing moved away, slowly, faintly, until I couldn't hear it anymore. I stayed awake until the first touch of light came through the window. The moment I saw the trees turning gray instead of black, I grabbed my bag and opened the door. The yard was empty. The slope was quiet, but the ground near the cabin was disturbed again. Fresh marks in the soil, deep and heavy, leading back into the woods. I didn't look twice. I went straight to the trail, walking fast at first, then faster until I was almost running. The woods felt too close around me, the air too cold and sharp. Every snapped twig made my heart jump. Several times I looked behind me, certain I would see something following. But I saw nothing, only the dark trees, the morning fog, and the narrow path stretching ahead. When I finally reached my car, I felt like my legs might give out. I threw my bag inside, started the engine, and drove down the rough dirt road until the forest thinned and sunlight finally reached the ground. I didn't stop driving until I reached the highway. I never went back to that cabin. I never asked the owner about the tracks or the sounds. I didn't want answers. All I know is that something or someone was out there in those woods. Something that moved slowly, heavily, and without any fear of being known. Something that stood outside my walls in the middle of the night and listened to me breathe. And the clearest part of the whole experience, the part one still think about years later, is that I never once heard it speak, never heard it run or shout or call out. It simply watched. It moved closer each night. And if I had stayed one more morning, I believe with absolute certainty that I would not have made it out of those woods alive. I was 29 when I decided to spend a weekend alone in an old cabin deep inside the northern woods of Montana. It was early October of 2017, the kind of cold that made your hands numb even while carrying hot coffee. I had taken time off work because I felt worn out, tired of noise, tired of screens, tired of people everywhere. The cabin belonged to a distant relative who barely used it anymore. He told me it was old but safe, and that the forest around it stayed quiet most of the year. That was all I wanted, quiet. The road leading to the cabin looked more like a forgotten path. Most of it was mud, and broken branches scraped the sides of my car every few minutes. I had to park almost half a mile away because a fallen tree blocked the last stretch. I carried a heavy backpack, a small cooler, and a lantern since the cabin had no working power except for an old generator. The sky looked pale and empty, and the air felt colder the further I walked. The cabin itself looked tired. The wood was dark and swollen from years of snow and rain. The windows had dirt baked into the corners. The steps creaked under my weight, loud enough that I felt the vibrations in the boards. Inside, the air smelled like old paper and wet dust. There was a small bed pushed against the right wall, a wooden table, a metal stove, and shelves filled with rusty tools. Everything looked still, untouched for a long time. I unpacked slowly, trying to get used to the silence. It was the kind of silence that made you aware of your own breathing. I set my backpack near the bed, opened the small window, and let the cold air flow in. For a while, I felt calm. I walked around inside, checking every corner, every crack in the floor, every drawer. It all looked normal, just old and forgotten. As the sun started to drop, the temperature inside the cabin fell fast. I lit the lantern and tried to start the stove. The metal rattled, and thick air puffed out when I opened the door. I set in some dry wood that I had brought with me and got a small fire going. The light flickered against the walls, stretching shadows into strange shapes, but I forced myself not to overthink anything. I kept telling myself it was only a weekend. Just sleep, rest, and go home. Around midnight, something woke me. I didn't know what it was at first. It wasn't a sound exactly, more like a pressure, something pushing itself into my awareness. I opened my eyes, and the room looked darker than before. The lantern had burned low. The fire in the stove was almost gone. The air felt heavier, colder. I could see my own breath hanging above me. I lay still, trying to figure out if I had heard anything. The forest outside was usually full of night sounds. Wind, insects, the occasional animal, but now it felt empty. Then I heard something faint, something soft outside the cabin. It wasn't footsteps, more like a slow brushing sound moving along the outer wall. The wood groaned lightly as if something leaned against it. I stayed frozen. Every part of me felt tight. The brushing noise moved from one side of the cabin to the back, slow and steady, like someone dragging a coat or maybe a long branch against the wall. I tried to pull logic into my head. Maybe it was just wind pushing some debris around, but the air outside had been still earlier. I hadn't felt a single breeze all day. The noise stopped for several seconds, and the quiet pressed down harder than before. I waited. My heart was beating so strongly that I could feel it in my neck. Then, from the back of the cabin, I heard another sound, this time sharper. A short thud, not loud, but clear enough to recognize that something had touched the wall with real weight. I slid out of the bed as slowly as I could, trying not to make the boards creak. My feet felt numb on the cold floor. I grabbed the lantern and shook it until the flame grew brighter. I didn't want to go outside, not in that darkness, not knowing what was making that noise. So I stayed inside and listened, holding my breath every few seconds. For nearly 20 minutes, nothing happened. The quiet slowly returned, but it didn't feel peaceful. It felt like whatever had been outside was waiting. I didn't sleep again that night. I sat on the edge of the bed with the lantern beside me, staring at the door until the sky turned pale gray. When daylight finally came, I stepped outside. My hands shook a little from the tiredness and cold. The ground around the cabin looked normal at first. Then I saw marks near the back wall. Long, thin scratches in the dirt that curved slightly, as if something had dragged across it. Next to the scratches were deeper impressions, like someone's knee had pressed into the ground. They were too wide and too uneven to be from an animal. They didn't match anything I could recognize. They looked messy, desperate. I walked around the cabin again and found more signs in the thin layer of old pine needles. Small patches where the needles had been pushed aside unevenly. It looked like someone had moved around slowly, crouched low, circling the place. A heavy feeling spread through my chest. I packed my things without even stopping to eat. I kept looking over my shoulder every few minutes, expecting to see someone standing between the trees. The forest felt different now. Too quiet, too still, like it was holding its breath. The walk back to my car felt longer than when I arrived. When I finally reached it, the doors were covered in dried mud. Not splashes, but hand-shaped smears dragged downward. I stared at them for a long time. The height of the smears was strange, too low for a standing adult, too high for a child. I didn't investigate further. I unlocked the car, threw everything into the back seat, and drove until the trees thinned and the road became normal again. Even then, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting something to step onto the road behind me. When I got home that evening, I felt an exhaustion I had never felt before. I didn't tell anyone what happened. I knew what people would say, some animal, some trick of the cold, my mind playing games with me. But I knew what I heard. I knew what I saw on the ground and on my car door. There was no ghost, no creature from a story. Something real had been out there. Something or someone that moved slowly around the cabin in the dark, dragging its weight along the walls, studying the place, waiting for something I didn't want to understand. I never went back to that cabin, and I never asked what else had happened there before I arrived. The ending stayed clear in my mind. Whatever was out there that night wasn't confused, wasn't lost, and wasn't an animal. It had purpose, and the marks I saw on the cabin and on my car made it certain that it had come close, much closer than anyone would ever want something unknown to come. I left before sunrise saved me, and I will never risk being out there when the dark returns again. It was the summer of 2017 when I decided to escape the city and spend a week alone in a cabin tucked deep in the woods of northern Vermont. I had just turned 27 and felt the weight of routine pressing down on me. The endless work emails, the ceaseless noise of traffic, the constant hum of other people's lives. I thought a week of solitude would clear my head. The cabin I rented was small, old, and made entirely of dark pine logs. It sat at the end of a narrow dirt road that disappeared into dense trees on both sides. The previous tenant had left a stack of firewood near the porch and a handwritten note warning me to lock everything and don't leave after dark. But I laughed it off at the time. The first day was idyllic. I unpacked my bag, lit a fire in the stone fireplace, and settled in with a couple of books. The air smelled like wet pine and moss, and birds filled the trees with their songs. I walked down a small path to a nearby stream, skipping stones across the water and watching minnows dart between rocks. At night, the forest seemed alive in a way I'd never noticed in the city. The sound of branches rubbing together, the rustle of small animals in the undergrowth, the distant hoot of an owl. It was peaceful, almost meditative. It was the second night that things started to feel off. I had cooked a simple dinner of pasta and beans and was sitting near the fire, feeling the warmth seep into my bones. Around 10:30, I heard the first strange sound, a soft crunch outside the cabin. At first, I assumed it was a raccoon or deer, but the rhythm of the footsteps didn't match anything I recognized. It was deliberate, heavy, slow. I froze and listened. The sound stopped. My heart was racing, but I told myself it was nothing, probably a fox or a stray dog. Still, I double-checked that the door and windows were locked. The next day, I went into the nearest town, a tiny place called Birch Hollow, to buy supplies. The store was dusty, with cracked linoleum floors, and the old woman behind the counter gave me a cautious look when I asked for extra propane for the stove. I mentioned the footsteps, and she simply shook her head. "Woods aren't as empty as they look," she said. I nodded, feeling uneasy, but I didn't press. By the time I returned, the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows that made the trees look like dark silhouettes against the fading light. That night, the footsteps returned. They were louder this time, circling the cabin, stopping near the back door. I could hear a subtle scrape, like someone dragging a foot across the ground. I stayed quiet, holding a heavy flashlight in one hand and a hatchet in the other, the old instincts from childhood horror movies screaming at me to run or hide. I stayed frozen for what felt like hours, until eventually the sounds faded. I didn't sleep well, if at all. The third day, I went exploring. The cabin came with a small, overgrown trail that led to an abandoned logging site. The site had rotting wooden structures, toppled equipment, and a half-collapsed barn. Felt like stepping back in time. As I wandered, I noticed something odd, fresh tire tracks in the mud. Not from a small car, but a large truck or SUV. There were no houses nearby that I knew of, just the cabin I was renting and the thick forest around it. The tracks led deeper into the woods, away from the cabin. I took a photo with my phone, just in case, and returned quickly. That night, I decided to sleep with the lights on. Around 2 a.m., I woke to a shadow crossing the window. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but then I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. A figure crouched near the back door, holding something long and thin, like a stick or pipe. My heart nearly stopped. I stayed as still as possible, barely breathing. The figure didn't move for what seemed like an eternity before slipping back into the trees. I waited for another hour, watching from the window, until the forest returned to silence. I realized I couldn't stay there another night. I packed quickly at first light, trying to make as little noise as possible. I left the cabin door slightly open, hoping it would seem like someone was still inside, and followed the dirt road back toward civilization. The forest seemed less welcoming than when I arrived. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the underbrush made me jump. When I finally reached the paved road, I flagged down a car for a ride. Once I was safely back in the city, I called the rental agency to explain why I was leaving early. The man on the other end listened carefully. "You did the right thing," he said. "That cabin has been broken into before. Someone's been living nearby, watching, waiting. The previous tenant disappeared for a few days, too. Never found out why." My stomach sank. I hadn't imagined it. Those footsteps, the shadow, the tracks, they were real. A few months later, I found a news report about a man arrested for hiding in abandoned cabins and stalking hikers in the northern Vermont woods. The authorities discovered hidden campsites, weapons, and detailed notes about people renting cabins alone. It matched exactly what I had experienced. I shuddered thinking how close I had come. Now, whenever I think about the cabin, I remember the smell of damp pine, the sound of the creek, and the way the forest seemed alive with eyes watching from the darkness. I don't go camping alone anymore, and I never forget to check my surroundings. It taught me that isolation in nature isn't always peaceful. Sometimes it's dangerous, and the quietest woods can hide the most terrifying things. I never returned to Vermont, and I don't plan to, but I keep that week in my memory, a reminder of how close fear can come when you think you're alone, and how clarity comes not from ignoring danger, but respecting it. I never planned on spending a full week alone in the mountains of northern Colorado, but I told myself I needed the break. I was 32, tired of city noise, tired of people, tired of screens, and tired of feeling like my mind was always buzzing. So when an old coworker mentioned he had a family cabin I could use, I took the chance without thinking too much. It sat near the edge of a forest at the base of a long ridge, built in the early 1970s, away from towns and far away from anything that felt familiar. I drove there in late October of 2019. The air had already started to turn sharp, and the trees looked like they had been drained of color. By the time I reached the gravel road that led to the cabin, my phone had lost all signal. I didn't care. I thought the silence would be good for me. The cabin looked smaller than I expected. The wood was dark from years of weather, and the roof sagged slightly in the middle. There were metal shutters on the windows, and the porch creaked under my weight when I stepped onto it. Inside, the place smelled old, like dry wood mixed with the faint sourness of something left closed up for too long. Dust lay on every surface. There was a small kitchen, a single bedroom, a bathroom, and a living area with a wood stove and a thin rug that curled at the edges. I spent the first hour cleaning, opening windows, wiping surfaces, and sweeping the floors until the air felt clearer. The forest outside stood completely still, like it was watching me. The silence had a weight to it I wasn't used to. No cars, no voices, not even wind. The first night passed quietly. I made a simple dinner, sat on the porch for a while, and listened to nothing but my own breathing. When darkness came, it came hard and fast, with no glow from any nearby town to soften it. I climbed into the old bed and wrapped myself in 2 blankets. The mattress springs pressed into my back, but exhaustion kept me from caring. At some point, I fell asleep. The second night felt different. I had spent most of the day hiking along a narrow trail behind the cabin. The ground was covered in dead leaves, and each step cracked louder than it should have. When I returned in the late afternoon, I noticed deep marks on one side of the cabin wall. They looked like long scratches, not fresh but not old either. I tried to brush it off as animal damage. Maybe a bear, maybe something else. I didn't let myself think about it for long. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. I could hear small sounds, too light to be anything dangerous, just branches falling or small animals moving around. But at some point, maybe close to midnight, I heard something heavier. Footsteps. Slow, steady. Not on the porch, not inside, but moving around the cabin close to the walls. The sound came and went like whatever was making it paused between steps. I tried to convince myself it was a deer, but something about the rhythm felt wrong. Deer don't move like that. I kept my eyes open until they hurt, waiting for another sound. Nothing else came. Eventually, I slept again, though it felt like I drifted in and out rather than truly resting. The next day, while making breakfast, I looked out the kitchen window and saw something strange in the dirt near the back steps. Footprint. A single one. Human. Barefoot. It was angled slightly like whoever left it had been turning. The toes were clear, and the heel was deep. The size looked close to mine. I stood there staring at it, my stomach tightening. I knew I wasn't sleepwalking. I wasn't someone who did things like that without remembering. I went outside to look around. The ground was hard and cold, and the footprint was the only one visible. No trail leading to it. No trail leading away. Just that one mark. I walked around the cabin again and found another thing I hadn't noticed before. The metal shutters on the back windows were partly bent outward, as if someone had tried to pry them open. I felt something inside me shift. Quiet panic. A realization that maybe I should not have come alone. I spent the rest of the day inside, keeping myself busy with anything I could find. Cleaning, checking cupboards, rearranging shelves, just to keep my mind from spiraling. I kept looking out the windows even when I didn't mean to. The forest didn't feel peaceful anymore. Felt like it was hiding something. That night was the worst. I didn't sleep, not even for a second. The footsteps came back, circling the cabin slowly. Sometimes they stopped right outside the bedroom wall, close enough that I could imagine a face pressed against the wood, listening. The cabin was so old that every sound traveled through it. I could hear breathing, slow, heavy breathing. I lay completely still, barely letting myself inhale. Every part of me tensed until my muscles shook. Hours passed like that. I watched shadows move across the ceiling from branches outside swaying in the wind. I counted seconds to keep myself from losing control. At one point, something brushed against the side of the cabin. Not claws, not an animal. Something that sounded like fingers running along the wood. When the sun finally rose, I still hadn't moved. The moment the sky turned light, the footsteps stopped. I waited another full hour before getting up. I decided I had to leave that morning. I didn't care how tired I was. I packed everything quickly, trying not to look at the windows. Before I walked out, I checked the ground one last time. There were no new footprints, no marks, nothing to prove what I had heard all night. The drive back down the mountain felt unreal. My hands shook on the steering wheel, and every shadow between the trees looked wrong. When I finally reached the nearest town and got cell service again, I felt my body loosen for the first time in days. I didn't call anyone. I didn't explain. I just kept driving. Weeks passed before I told anyone about it. Even then, I left out some details because I knew how it sounded. There were no ghosts, no strange creatures, nothing impossible. But something real was there in those woods and around that cabin. Something that watched me, walked around me, breathed near me, and waited outside my walls through the nights. Something human. The clear ending is this: I never went back to that cabin, and I never will. I learned that fear doesn't always come from things we can't explain. Sometimes the most terrifying thing is knowing that another person was out there, completely silent, completely patient, studying the place where I slept. And the worst part is knowing I never saw them, but they saw me. I had planned the trip for months, mostly because I wanted a break from the noise of the city. By late October of 2017, I felt worn down from long work weeks, crowded buses, and the constant feeling that I was running behind on everything. A friend had once told me about a cheap cabin in northern Alberta, near an old logging road that barely showed up on maps. The idea of spending a few days alone there seemed perfect, so I booked it without thinking much about anything except the peace I hoped to find. The drive took almost 9 hours, most of it along empty highways lined with trees that looked the same for miles. By the time I reached the dirt road that led to the cabin, the sky had turned pale and cold. The road was rough and narrow, with dips that made my car rattle louder than I liked. I kept telling myself that these roads always looked worse than they really were, even though every sharp rock made me imagine my tires going flat in the middle of nowhere. When I finally saw the cabin, I felt a small bit of relief. It sat in a clearing surrounded by tall, thin pine trees that barely moved in the wind. The cabin itself looked older than the photos I had seen online. The wood was darker and more worn, and the windows looked cloudy, almost like they had been wiped with muddy hands. Still, it looked stable enough. I told myself I had stayed in worse places during college trips and that this was fine. Inside, the air smelled like dry wood mixed with something faintly metallic, like old tools. The cabin had only 2 rooms, a small kitchen with a gas stove and an old fridge, and a sleeping area with a single cot and a wood stove beside it. Everything looked like it had been used by a long line of people who didn't care much about comfort. The floorboards were uneven and made soft cracking sounds under my shoes. I tried not to think about mice or insects hiding behind the walls and focused instead on unpacking my things. By early evening, the light outside had turned orange. I didn't realize how quickly the temperature dropped in that area. Even though I wore 2 layers, I could feel cold air slipping through gaps in the cabin walls. I lit the wood stove and sat on the edge of the cot, listening to the fire pop and settle. For a moment I felt calm. I could hear nothing but the stove and the distant wind brushing through the trees. But then I felt something strange, not like fear yet, but a sharp awareness that made my body tense. The kind of feeling you get when you have been alone for hours and suddenly realize how quiet everything is. I stood up and moved to one of the windows. The glass was so foggy I had to rub it with my sleeve to see outside. The clearing looked empty, just trees, cold dirt, and my car. I told myself I was just being dramatic. I walked back to the cot and tried to read, but after a few minutes I had to stop. I kept catching myself listening to things. Small sounds from outside that didn't match the wind. They were faint, but noticeable enough that my brain refused to ignore them. Slow, steady crunches, like something stepping on patches of frost or dry ground. Then silence. Then another faint step. I stared at the ceiling and tried to breathe normally. I knew the area had wildlife. Deer, foxes, maybe even moose. Animals made noise. That was normal. Still, something about the pattern of those steps felt off. Too spaced out. Too deliberate. The sound stopped for a while, and I almost managed to relax again. But just as I started to drift off, a sudden, sharp crack echoed from outside, like a branch snapping under weight. My eyes shot open. I sat up fast enough that the cot creaked loudly beneath me. I waited, counting the seconds in my head. The fire in the stove gave off a soft glow that reached only a few feet around. Everything else looked too dark. I didn't want to stand near the windows anymore. I didn't want to turn off the fire. I didn't want to lie down. So I sat there, not moving, staring at the floor until my back started to ache. At some point, I realized the sounds had gotten closer. Slow crunches again, but heavier this time, like something larger was moving near the walls. My heart pounded so hard it made my hands shake. I thought about the cabin photographs again. I remembered how old the wood looked, how thin the walls probably were. I imagined something brushing against them, testing them. I forced myself to stay still, but my mind raced. I had no signal on my phone. The nearest town was almost 2 hours away by car. The road was steep and full of holes. If something or someone was outside, I had nowhere to go except into the dark. Minutes passed like hours. The sounds moved around the cabin, circling slowly, stopping occasionally, as if whatever was out there was listening too. I kept waiting for another loud crack or a sudden impact, but it didn't happen. Instead, the noises slowly grew softer. Then they stopped completely. I didn't sleep at all that night. When the sun finally came up, the light felt almost unreal. I waited until it filled the whole cabin before stepping outside. The cold air hit my face hard, but the brightness helped steady my nerves. The first thing I noticed were the marks in the dirt near the back of the cabin. At first I thought they were animal tracks, but the closer I looked, the more wrong they appeared. They were long, uneven, dragged in some places, sharp in others. Something had moved around the cabin several times, close enough to touch the walls. There were even fresh scrapes on the wood, thin but deep, like something had pressed against it or dragged something across it. I didn't waste a second. I grabbed my bag, tossed everything into the car without bothering to pack properly, and drove away so fast I felt gravel hitting the bottom of the vehicle. The entire ride back felt like I was being chased, even though every time I checked the mirror, the road behind me was empty. When I got home that night, I finally allowed myself to breathe normally again. I told myself that maybe it had been an animal with an odd gait, or maybe several animals moving together. Maybe the tracks only looked strange because of the frost. Maybe the deep marks on the wall were from age or weather. But the truth is, I don't believe any of those explanations. I know what I heard. I know how deliberate those steps sounded. I know the way the cabin walls felt on the inside, like something heavy leaned against them for more than a moment. I didn't report anything. I didn't contact the cabin owner. I simply promised myself I would never go back to any remote place alone again, no matter how much peace I thought I wanted. Some quiet places aren't meant to be relaxing. Some are quiet because something out there is waiting for the dark to settle, listening for whoever is foolish enough to stay the night. I drove up to the mountains of northern Colorado in late October of 2019, hoping to spend a quiet week alone in a small rental cabin I found online. I was 31 at the time, and I had been tired of the noise, screens, and pressure of my everyday life. The photos made the cabin look simple but clean, with a small porch, a wood stove, and a dense forest around it. I thought the silence would help me clear my head. I didn't know how heavy silence could feel until the third night. The gravel road to the cabin was already half covered with frost when I arrived. The air felt colder than I expected for that month, and the mountain wind had a sharpness that cut through my jacket. The cabin was smaller than the pictures made it seem. The wood was darker, the windows were older, and the steps creaked before I even put my bags down. Still, it felt peaceful at first. Just trees, mountains, and a wide empty sky. Inside, everything had a faint smell of old pine and dust. The floorboards bent in certain places, and the only heat source was the ironwood stove in the corner. There was no phone signal, no internet, and only a weak radio channel that came and went. I told myself that I wanted exactly that. A break, a reset. During the first day, nothing felt strange. I unpacked, stacked some firewood outside, and tried to enjoy the quiet. At night, however, the forest sounded different from what I knew. In the city, you hear cars, people, sirens, or distant music. Out there, I heard nothing except the occasional snap of a branch or rustling leaves. The silence made every little sound sharper. I tried to sleep, but the cold and the unfamiliar darkness kept waking me. On the second day, I went for a walk around noon. The forest behind the cabin spread out in uneven slopes, with fallen logs and patches of dead grass. I found faint boot prints in the dirt about 20 minutes behind the cabin. They didn't seem fresh, but they weren't old either. I assumed the owner or previous renters had been there. I didn't think much about it. Later that evening, as the sun went down, the cabin felt colder than before. I fed more wood into the stove, but the heat faded too fast. The wind kept pushing against the cabin walls, and the metal roof clicked and popped. That night, I slept with my jacket on. Around 3 in the morning, I woke up because I felt a vibration through the mattress, like someone had touched the outside wall behind the bed. I sat still for a long time, listening. Nothing else happened, so I convinced myself it had been the wind or the shifting wood. On the third day, I noticed something that made me uneasy. When I stepped onto the porch that morning, there were marks in the frost near the steps. They looked like footprints, but they weren't from my boots. They were bigger, wider, and the strides seemed longer. I looked around the woods, expecting to see an animal, but the pattern looked human. The frost had melted enough that I couldn't tell anything clearly, so I tried to ignore it. Still, the idea of someone walking so close to the cabin while I slept bothered me. The temperature dropped even more that night. I could feel the cold crawling through the walls. I added extra logs to the stove and wrapped myself in 2 blankets. At some point, I drifted off, but a loud thud against the side of the cabin pulled me awake. I froze in place, staring into the darkness. The thud wasn't like a branch falling. It felt too deliberate, too heavy. I held my breath until my chest hurt. For a few minutes, everything was silent again. I knew I wouldn't sleep anymore. Early the next morning, I walked around the cabin to see if something had fallen or if an animal had bumped into it. Behind the cabin, the dirt was disturbed. Not scratched like an animal would do, but pressed down, flattened, like someone had been standing there for a long time, shifting their weight. The ground had frozen overnight, so the marks looked recent. My stomach tightened. I decided I would leave the next day, but the final night made that plan pointless. Around midnight, the stove fire was glowing low, and the cold had made the air inside sharp and thin. I lay fully awake, staring at the ceiling, counting each breath. Then I heard slow, deliberate footsteps on the porch. Not heavy stomps, careful steps, one at a time, the wood creaking under the weight. I felt my whole body lock up. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. I could picture the doorknob on the other side, cold and dull, inches away from a hand I couldn't see. The door didn't open. Nothing moved, but I could feel someone standing there. I didn't have a weapon, only a flashlight and a metal poker for the stove. I gripped the poker with both hands and waited. Minutes felt like hours. When I finally heard the steps move again, they went off the porch and into the forest. I didn't sleep at all after that. At sunrise, I packed everything as fast as I could. As I carried my bags to the car, I noticed new footprints in the frost. Large ones, deep, walking from the trees to the porch and then back into the woods. They were almost perfectly clear. They weren't mine. I didn't bother checking anything else. I just got in the car, locked the doors, and drove down the mountain road without looking back. My hands shook the entire drive, and I didn't stop until I reached a gas station near Fort Collins with real people inside and the sound of traffic filling the air. A week later, when I tried to check the listing for the cabin again out of curiosity, it was gone. No owner name, no record of recent rentals, nothing. I never went back to look for it. The ending is simple but real. Someone else had been around that cabin during those nights. Someone had stood outside while I slept. Someone had walked up onto the porch and stopped just feet from the door. Maybe they were passing through the woods. Maybe they were watching. Maybe they were waiting for something. I will never know who it was or what they wanted, but I know one thing clearly. If I had stayed one more night, I don't think I would have left the mountains at all. And that thought still keeps me awake sometimes. I didn't plan to stay in the cabin that long, but life has a funny way of stretching a weekend into something that feels like a week. It was October 1998, and I had decided to take a short break from my job in Minneapolis. I was 29 then, tired of the city's constant noise and the way buildings seemed to press down on me. I rented a small, wooden cabin near a lake in northern Wisconsin. The owner, a wiry man with sun-baked skin, handed me a set of keys and warned me that cell service was patchy at best. I thought nothing of it. My whole point was to disappear for a while. The first day was quiet. The cabin was old but solid, made of dark pine that smelled faintly of resin and would smoke. The living room had a stone fireplace, though I didn't plan to light it. The air was crisp outside, but inside it was still warm from the remnants of the summer sun. I unpacked my bag, making sure my journal, flashlight, and a small bag of canned food were close by. I liked to be prepared, especially when I went somewhere remote. By evening, the wind had picked up, sending a soft tapping sound against the windows. I brewed some coffee, wrapped myself in a thick blanket, and stared out at the lake. The water was gray under the fading light, surrounded by dense forest that looked impenetrable. There was a certain peace in it, but also a strange tension, like the forest was holding its breath. I shook off the feeling, telling myself it was just the isolation getting to me. That night, I slept lightly, waking more than once to the sound of the wind rattling the cabin. Around 2 in the morning, I was pulled fully awake by a different noise. A soft, shuffling sound outside, just beyond the small porch. My first thought was an animal. Bears were common in those parts, though I had never seen one close enough to feel fear. I grabbed my flashlight and crept to the window, shining it across the yard. Nothing. The trees swayed, their branches scratching at each other, but there was no sign of movement on the ground. I tried to convince myself it was a raccoon or deer, maybe even a stray fox. I fell back asleep around 4, but the next morning, a sense of unease lingered. I kept noticing small things that didn't make sense. My firewood stack, which I had built carefully, had a log slightly out of place. Footprints in the mud outside were oddly deep, as if someone had stepped in the wet soil overnight. And yet, the cabin door was locked, the windows secure. I double-checked everything, feeling a cold prickle at the back of my neck. The second night was worse. Around 11 p.m., I was reading by the dim light of a lantern when I heard it again. Soft shuffling, this time from the far side of the cabin. My heart raced. I grabbed the hunting knife I had brought for emergencies, and I cautiously walked to the door, peering through the peephole. Nothing. Then I realized the sound wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from the attic. The cabin had a small ladder leading up to a loft, which I hadn't explored. I had assumed it was for storage, but now my curiosity was mixed with fear. I slowly climbed, every rung creaking under my weight, and stopped just short of the loft entrance. A single beam of moonlight fell across the wooden floorboards. Then I saw it. A box, old and scratched, that hadn't been there before. My hands shook as I approached. I pried it open and found something that made my blood run cold. Inside were several cameras, old film reels, and a notebook with detailed observations. The pages described the cabin's previous tenants, their habits, their routines, even when they went to bed. Whoever had done this had been watching people, recording them. I realized, with a sinking feeling, that the shuffling and footprints weren't random. Someone had been here, hidden, watching. Panic surged, but I forced myself to think. I checked the windows, barricaded the door with a chair, and stayed as quiet as possible. I spent the rest of the night awake, listening to every sound. By dawn, the wind had died down, and the forest seemed calm again, almost ordinary. I knew I couldn't stay. I packed my things quickly and left, careful not to touch anything in the loft. As I drove down the narrow dirt road, I looked back at the cabin. The windows glinted in the morning sun, ordinary and harmless looking. It didn't feel real that someone had been inside, observing every move I made. I reported the cabin to the local authorities when I got back to the city. They investigated but found no signs of the watcher. They suspected the previous tenant had fled. I never stayed in a remote cabin again. Even now, 27 years later, I sometimes wonder who else had been in that forest, watching. The thought still sends a shiver down my spine. But one thing is certain. I survived because I trusted my instincts, stayed calm, and didn't underestimate the danger. That clarity, that attention to small details saved me. I left the cabin, but the lesson stayed with me. The world has quiet corners where someone might be watching, and sometimes the scariest part is knowing you were never alone. I drove up into the northern woods of Montana in late October of 2019, a time of year when the cold settles deep into the trees and the days feel shorter than they should. I was 32 at the time, tired from months of nonstop work, and the idea of staying alone in a small rental cabin sounded like the perfect way to clear my head. I had found the place online, a simple wooden cabin sitting at the edge of a lake that barely showed up on maps. The pictures made it look peaceful and clean. I didn't expect anything strange. I just wanted quiet. The dirt road leading to the cabin was almost too narrow for my old truck. branches scraped along the side the whole way down. When I finally saw the cabin, I felt a small wave of relief. It looked worn but solid, dark wooden boards, a tin roof, and a small porch with a single chair. I noticed right away that the trees around it were packed tightly together, thicker than I imagined from the photos. The lake behind the cabin was still and dark, almost black under the cloudy sky. There was no cell signal at all, but I had expected that. Inside, the place smelled like old pine and dust. There were 2 small rooms, one with a bed against the wall and a window facing the lake, and one with a tiny kitchen area and a wood stove. I unpacked my bag, lit the stove, and sat down on the creaky chair by the window. The quiet settled faster than I liked. It wasn't peaceful like I had imagined. It felt heavier, like the woods were swallowing up every sound before it reached me. The first night, nothing major happened, but I remember lying in bed with the covers pulled tight and noticing how different darkness feels when it's miles from any town. The woods outside didn't sound alive the way I expected. There were no insects buzzing, no owls calling, no rustling, just a low, steady hum of wind pushing through branches. That silence kept me awake longer than I wanted, but eventually I drifted off. The next morning, the ground outside was wet from a light rain. I stepped onto the porch to breathe in the cold air. That's when I saw the footprints in the mud. They weren't animal prints. They were from boots, and they came out of the trees and stopped a few feet from the cabin's right wall. They didn't continue anywhere. Not toward the door, not toward the lake, not back into the woods. Just a single line of prints that ended near the wall like whoever made them had stood there for a long time. I stood there staring at them for almost a full minute. The prints looked fresh, edges still sharp, but the rain should have softened them. It didn't make sense. My first thought was that they belonged to whoever maintained the cabin, but the more I stared, the more wrong it felt. They were facing directly toward the bedroom window, the one I slept next to. I tried to shake it off. I spent the day hiking around the lake, gathering firewood, and trying to convince myself that the prints were old and somehow untouched by the rain. But the entire hike I felt like something was wrong with the air. Felt like the woods were holding their breath. Even the ground felt softer, as if I was stepping on layers of wet leaves that had been rotting for years. When night came, I kept hearing small noises outside the cabin. Nothing dramatic, just tiny, quick sounds like something brushing against the outer wall or snapping light twigs. I kept telling myself it was the wind, but it didn't match the rhythm of wind. It was too precise, too controlled. I barely slept. The second morning, I found something worse. Behind the cabin, near the back window, I saw a small pile of stones stacked in a neat triangle. They were too clean, almost washed, and placed carefully like someone wanted me to notice them. I didn't know what to think, but a tight feeling formed in my stomach. Someone had been behind the cabin that night. I was sure of it. I kept checking the trees, looking for any movement, but everything was still. Around noon, I walked around the cabin's perimeter again and noticed scratches on the right side of the wooden wall, long and thin, like something sharp had been dragged downward slowly. The marks were new. I would have noticed them on the first day. I ran my hand over them and felt the rawness of the wood. Whoever made them had done it in the last few hours. That entire day I couldn't relax. I sat inside with the stove burning too hot, making the air dry and uncomfortable, but I felt safer with the heat. Every time I looked at the window, I imagined someone standing just outside my sight line. I didn't go to bed until after midnight, and even then I slept in short bursts. Sometime around 3 in the morning, I woke up suddenly, not from a noise, but from the feeling that something was wrong. My chest felt tight. I lay still and listened. The cabin was silent except for the faint crackling of cooling wood in the stove. I turned my head slightly toward the window. The glass was almost completely black, reflecting only a faint outline of my bed. I kept staring, not sure why, until I noticed something I didn't see at first. A shape, not clear, but darker than the darkness behind it. It was standing close outside the window, almost pressed against the glass. I couldn't make out a face, but I knew it was a person. I didn't move. I didn't blink. I just kept staring at the black outline of a head and shoulders. It didn't move either. I don't know how long we stayed like that, maybe 30 seconds, maybe a full minute, but suddenly the shape shifted slightly, like it leaned closer. My whole body froze. Couldn't breathe. I wanted to get up, but I felt glued to the bed. The shape remained there for a few seconds more, then it slowly stepped back. I didn't hear footsteps, which terrified me more. It just melted into the darkness. I didn't sleep after that. I waited until the very first hint of light touched the trees before grabbing my bag. When I went outside, the ground around the cabin looked disturbed, like someone had walked back and forth many times. The footprints were messy and spread out, as if someone had circled the cabin again and again during the night. The stacked stones were gone. I didn't bother cleaning up. I got in my truck and drove as fast as the narrow dirt road allowed. I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see someone stepping onto the road behind me. The woods felt tighter than before, almost pushing inward, and the road felt longer than when I arrived. When I finally reached the main road, I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest town. I parked in a gas station lot and sat there for a long time, just trying to breathe normally again. I didn't call the owner of the cabin or report anything. I didn't have any proof. All I had was fear and the image of that dark shape standing at my window. In the months after, I kept thinking about the footprints from the first morning. The way they stood facing my window, the scratches on the wall, the stones. All of it pointed to one simple, horrible truth. Someone had been watching me from the moment I arrived. Someone who knew I was alone, far from help, with no signal, no neighbors, and no one expecting me back immediately. I haven't gone camping alone since. I haven't rented another remote cabin, no matter how peaceful it looks in photos. Every time I think about that place, I remember the shape standing outside the window, silent and patient. And I know without any doubt that if I had stayed one more night, things would have ended very differently. And the worst part, the part one still tried to ignore, is that the cabin is still out there. And whoever watched me is probably still out there too, waiting for the next person who thinks they just need a quiet break in the woods. I had booked the old cabin in northern Alberta for one reason: silence. I had been working non-stop for months and felt like my nerves were made of thin wires pulled too tight. The photos online showed a small wooden cabin at the edge of a frozen lake, surrounded by thick pine forest. It looked peaceful. The owner wrote that the place was built in the late 1960s and had been maintained well enough. I didn't care. I wanted a place where I could hear myself think. I arrived in the early afternoon, in late November of 2019, just before the sun dipped behind the trees. The sky had that dull gray look that made everything feel farther away than it actually was. My car rattled over the rough dirt road for almost an hour before the cabin finally appeared between the trees. It looked smaller in person, narrower, like it was being squeezed by the forest around it. The cabin sat on a patch of hard, frozen earth. The lake behind it was covered in a thin layer of pale ice. The woods were cold and quiet, so quiet that even small sounds seemed too loud. When I stepped out of the car, the crunch of ice under my boots sounded sharp enough to break the air itself. The wind barely moved, just brushed through the trees now and then. Inside, the cabin smelled old, like dry wood that had soaked up decades of smoke and damp. There was one bedroom, a small kitchen, and a living area with an old iron stove. The furniture looked like it belonged to someone who didn't care about comfort. The floor creaked with almost every step, even when I tried to move lightly. I told myself the place had character. I unpacked slowly, trying to settle in. I didn't plan on doing much. Maybe read, maybe walk around the lake, maybe just sleep. The weather was supposed to stay calm, and the owner had stocked the cabin with firewood. It all seemed simple enough, but from the first night, something felt wrong. It wasn't anything supernatural. It was small things, ordinary things, but I felt each one too sharply. When the wind moved past the cabin, it sounded like someone dragging cloth along the outer wall. When I walked from the bedroom to the kitchen, I felt a faint vibration under the floor, as if something deeper in the ground shifted slowly. I tried to ignore it. It was an old place. Old places make noises. On the second night, I woke up suddenly, unsure why. It was still dark. The cabin was freezing, even though I had kept the fire going before bed. I could see my breath in the beam of my flashlight. My first thought was that I had slept too long and the fire had died out. But when I went to check the stove, the ashes were still warm. The cold felt unnatural, but I pushed that thought away. I grabbed more firewood and built the flames back up until the cabin felt somewhat normal. When I went back to bed, I felt something strange through the floorboards. A faint, steady vibration, almost like the hum of machinery far underground. The cabin was in the middle of nowhere. There was nothing out here, no factories, no roads besides the one dirt track, no other houses for miles. The feeling lasted only a few seconds, then faded. The next day, I found tracks in the snow behind the cabin. Not animal tracks, boot prints. I could see how the snow around them had frozen over slightly, which meant they weren't fresh but also not very old. They led from the edge of the forest straight toward the back door, then turned and went toward the lake. The lake was frozen, but the ice near the shore was thin. The tracks stopped at the edge like the person either turned back or fell in. I stood there for a long time, trying to make sense of them. Maybe another hiker, maybe the owner, maybe some local wandering around. But I didn't like that they came right up to the cabin. That evening, the feeling of being watched settled over me so strongly that I kept looking out the windows. Every shadow between the trees looked like it had weight. I tried reading, but every single sound stole my focus. The groan of wood, the whisper of wind, the shift of ice on the lake. Around midnight, I heard something outside. Not footsteps, not talking, just a short, heavy thump, like someone had dropped a large piece of wood behind the cabin. I froze. I didn't want to check, but I also didn't want to sit in fear. After several minutes, I grabbed my flashlight and walked to the back door. My hand shook on the latch. When I stepped outside, the air felt sharp and painful in my lungs. The beam of my light cut across the ice and the edge of the woods. Nothing moved. There was nothing on the ground except the same old boot prints. But when I turned to go back inside, I noticed something new. A fresh print right beside the bottom step of the cabin. Only one. Deep, clean, and facing the door. It hadn't been there earlier. I shut myself inside and jammed a chair under the door handle even though I knew it probably wouldn't help much. I sat in the living room with my flashlight pointed at the door until the fire burned low again. I didn't sleep at all. By the fourth night, I knew I needed to leave, but a cold front had blown in and blocked the narrow dirt road. Snow had piled so high around my car that the tires were half buried. I spent an hour trying to dig it out with a metal cooking pot from the kitchen, but the snow kept falling, thick and heavy. The air felt strange, dense, pressing against my skin. Every time I looked toward the woods, I felt a sharp tension in my shoulders. That night was the worst. I was lying awake, staring at the ceiling, when the vibration under the floor returned. Stronger this time, steady enough that the objects on the kitchen counter rattled. It felt like something large was moving deep underground. Then the vibration stopped suddenly, and the cabin fell into a silence so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat. A few seconds later, I heard slow, careful footsteps on the snow outside. They circled the cabin once, then again. Each step was deliberate, spaced apart, as if the person knew I was listening. The footsteps stopped at the front door. I stared at the handle, waiting for it to move. Didn't. Nothing happened. No knock, no attempt to force the door. Just silence. The minutes dragged on like hours. Eventually, exhaustion forced my eyes shut even though I was terrified. When I woke at dawn, the footsteps were gone. The snow outside the cabin was smooth again, no tracks. None at all. Even the older ones had disappeared under the new snowfall. I packed my things without eating or thinking. I fought the snow around my car with both hands until my fingers burned, and eventually I managed to move it enough to force the wheels free. I didn't look back when I drove away. The trees felt too close. The air felt too heavy. When I reached the main road hours later, the tension in my chest finally loosened. It felt like I had been holding my breath the whole time I was there. Later that week, out of curiosity, I checked the listing for the cabin again. The owner had removed it. No explanation, no note. The place simply vanished from the website like it had never existed. I still don't know who was out there, I don't know what I felt under the floor or why someone walked so slowly around the cabin in the middle of the night. Maybe it was just a person living in the woods. Maybe someone was using the cabin when no one was renting it. Maybe something was happening in the ground beneath it that no one talks about. But I do know this. The silence I went looking for was never silence at all. It was something waiting, something paying too much attention. And I won't go back to a place like that again. Not ever. I drove into the northern woods of Montana in late October of 2019, a week before the heavy snow was supposed to start. I was 31 at the time, and I had rented a small wooden cabin near the base of a ridge called Bear Hook Hill. I wanted a quiet place to finish a project, clear my head, and get away from the clutter of my life in the city. The cabin belonged to an older couple who lived 40 minutes away, and they warned me that cell service would be almost gone once I passed the last paved road. I thought that would make the trip even better. The place looked simple when I arrived: dark brown logs, a metal roof, a short porch, and a small storage shed a few yards behind it. The nearest cabin I had passed was about a mile away, hidden behind thick pines. The air smelled like cold dirt, old leaves, and sap. Everything felt open and silent in a way I wasn't used to. I unloaded my things, walked through the inside, and noticed how clean it was. A stone fireplace, a single bedroom, a small kitchenette, no TV, only a battery-powered radio sitting on a shelf. The first 2 days were peaceful. I spent hours writing, walking through the woods, and listening to the wind move through the trees. At night, I could hear small animals moving in the brush, twigs snapping, and sometimes the distant sound of an owl. The cabin walls were thin, so every outside noise felt closer than it really was. I didn't mind. It made me feel alone but not unsafe. The third night is when everything changed. It started with a dull thud outside around midnight. I was still awake, lying on the couch because the bedroom felt too cold. The sound wasn't sharp or heavy. It reminded me of someone dropping a small log onto the dirt. I stayed still and waited for it to repeat, but the woods went quiet again. A few minutes later, I heard another thud, this time slightly closer to the cabin. I sat up and looked toward the front window, but all I saw was darkness. There were no lights out there, not even moonlight because the sky had clouded over. Another thud came, slower this time, almost like something was being dragged or pushed. For a moment, I told myself it was just the wind knocking something over, maybe a loose branch or a chunk of wood, but the sound was too steady for that. Then came a faint crunch of dirt, the kind footsteps make when someone is trying not to be heard. I walked quietly to the window, keeping the lights off so I wouldn't be visible. I leaned just enough to peek outside, but the porch light was off and I didn't want to switch it on. I stared at the black, waiting for a shape or movement. Nothing showed. After a while, the noises stopped, and I tried to convince myself it was a deer or some other animal looking for food. I went back to the couch, but I hardly slept. The next morning, I walked around the cabin to check for tracks. The ground was cold but dry enough to hold marks. I expected to see hoof prints or something natural. Instead, I found 2 long impressions near the side wall, almost like someone had dragged a heavy bag or a thick piece of fabric across the dirt. They led from the tree line toward the back shed and then stopped. I looked around for any sign of someone hiding or watching, but the woods were empty and quiet. Still, something about those marks made me feel watched. That night, the noises came back, but they were different. Softer at first, then heavier. I could hear slow steps near the back of the cabin, then a long pause, then another step. Whoever or whatever it was moved with an odd rhythm. Not like an animal, more like someone walking barefoot on cold ground and taking their time. At one point, the steps stopped right behind the bedroom wall. I held my breath and listened. A faint scrape ran along the wood, slow and steady, as if a finger or a stick was dragging across it. I felt every hair on my body rise. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I waited for the sound to repeat, but it didn't. Instead, the woods went silent again. A heavy, thick silence that made the air feel tight. The morning after that, I found something new. Behind the cabin, near the shed, lay a small torn piece of dark fabric caught on a low branch. It looked like the corner of a jacket or maybe a shirt. It wasn't mine. I had unpacked everything I brought, and nothing matched the material. That was the first moment I felt fear, not from imagination, but from proof. Someone had been there. I spent the rest of the day inside with the door locked. The sky stayed gray, the wind stayed cold, and every creak of the cabin made me jump. I kept thinking about how far I was from help. I had no cell service, no neighbors nearby, no roads anyone used often. When night fell, I stayed on the couch with the fire burning low. I kept a heavy flashlight next to me because it was the only thing that felt like a weapon. For hours, nothing happened. I thought maybe whoever had been lurking had moved on. But sometime after 2 in the morning, the sounds returned. Not steps this time, not dragging. A slow, steady pressure against the back door, like someone testing it. Pushing just enough to check the lock, but not enough to break it. I stared at the door from across the room, hardly blinking. The wood flexed slightly under the pressure. Then it stopped. A few minutes passed. Then I heard the softest, most controlled breathing coming from the other side of the door. It wasn't animal breathing. It was too slow, too deliberate. My body went cold. I didn't move. The breathing stayed there for a long time, maybe 5 minutes, maybe longer. Then I heard steps moving away toward the tree line. At sunrise, I packed everything as fast as I could. I didn't eat. I didn't clean. I just shoved my gear into the car and got out of there. As I drove down the dirt road, I checked my mirrors again and again. At one point, I saw a shape near the trees, standing still, watching my car move away. I couldn't make out the face, but the figure didn't move. It just stood straight, arms at the sides, facing me. I didn't stop. I didn't look back a second time. When I finally reached the paved road and my phone signal returned, I felt like I could breathe again. I called the cabin owners later and told them I left early because I wasn't feeling well. I didn't mention anything else. I never went back to that area, not even to drive by. Sometimes late at night, I still think about those dragging marks, the fabric piece, the breathing at the door, and that figure standing in the trees. I keep wondering what their plan was, why they tested the cabin first, why they didn't break in, why they moved so slowly night after night, as if they were waiting for something. But the clearest thought I have is the one that keeps me grateful. I left early. I didn't wait for another night. I didn't give whoever was out there more time. Leaving that morning didn't just get me away from the cabin. It saved me from becoming part of whatever that person was preparing for. And I still believe that if I had stayed even one more night, I never would have driven back out of those woods at all. I drove up to the cabin in the early evening, in late September of 2019, thinking it would help me clear my head. I had rented the place online without much thought, choosing it because it sat far away from the main road, surrounded by thick pine woods in northern Colorado. The photos made it look old but clean, a quiet place where I could get a break from my stressful job and the constant noise of the city. I was 28 at the time, tired, worn out, and ready to be alone for a few days. That was all I wanted. Silence and space. The dirt road leading to the cabin was narrower than I expected, with tire grooves faded and uneven. As I drove, tall trees pressed in from both sides, their branches bending over the road like they had been reaching toward each other for years. My car bounced over small rocks, and dust rose behind me in the orange evening light. I kept noticing that there were no other houses, no signs, no fences, nothing except thick woods. My phone signal had dropped about 20 minutes earlier, leaving me fully on my own, which I didn't mind at first. The cabin came into view as the road curved up a small hill. It sat in a clearing, small and dark brown, with a metal roof that looked newer than the rest of it. The wood boards on the walls were worn and stained by years of weather. The place looked slightly more run down than the photos, but I had expected that. A narrow porch wrapped around the front, and a single window faced the clearing. There were no cars, no footprints, and no sign that anyone had stayed there in weeks. I parked beside the porch and stepped out. The air felt colder than I thought it would. It had that sharp smell of pine and soil that hits your nose when you walk deep into the woods. There was barely any wind, just a steady quiet that felt heavy. When I unlocked the front door, it made a slow creaking sound that echoed through the empty interior. Inside, the place was simple. A small kitchen area, an old couch, a wooden table, and a single bedroom in the back. Dust covered most surfaces, but it wasn't filthy. It was just unused. The wooden floor felt solid when I walked, though some boards moved slightly under my weight. A faint smell of old smoke hung in the air, like someone had used the fireplace often in the winter and never aired the place out. I set my bag on the table and walked through each room, checking windows, making sure everything looked normal. There was nothing strange at first, just the quiet of a place forgotten for a while. But as I settled in, I felt something I couldn't name. Not fear, more like a mild pressure in my chest, the kind that comes when you sense that you should be paying attention to something but can't find what it is. I tried to ignore it by keeping myself busy. I put some food in the small fridge, unpacked my clothes, and swept some dust off the floor. When the sun finally dropped behind the trees, the cabin fell into a kind of darkness that felt different from city darkness. Out here, there were no street lights, no distant cars, no glow from neighboring windows. When night settled, it felt absolute. I turned on a single lamp and sat on the couch, listening to the forest outside. At first it was peaceful, crickets, the occasional rustle of wind, maybe the distant call of some animal. But then, after about an hour, the sounds began to shift. The crickets went silent. The wind seemed to stop completely. The silence became so thick that I felt like I could hear the blood in my ears. That was when I noticed the footsteps. They were faint at first, somewhere outside the cabin, slow and unsteady, like someone trying not to make noise but failing. The steps pressed into the ground with a soft crunch of dry needles. They moved from the trees into the clearing. Then they stopped, and the silence that followed felt worse than the sound itself. I stayed still, listening hard. I thought maybe it was a deer or some other animal moving around, but the steps had a rhythm that felt human. Careful, deliberate pace. I looked at the window. The lamp inside made it impossible to see out, but if someone was outside, they could see me clearly. The thought made my skin tighten. I turned off the lamp and let my eyes adjust to the darkness. The cabin became a set of vague shapes around me. Outside, the clearing was nothing but a darker patch of black surrounded by even deeper black. My heart beat so loud in my chest that it felt like it was shaking the couch. I waited for another sound, and after a long moment, the steps came again, closer this time, circling the cabin slowly, not running, not rushing, just moving with a kind of steady patience that made my hands shake. I backed toward the bedroom, not wanting to make noise on the creaky floorboards, but my foot pressed down on a loose board that let out a cracking pop. The steps outside stopped instantly. The silence returned, heavier than before, as if the whole forest was holding its breath. I stood in the dark for what felt like an hour, though it may have been only minutes. Then I heard the porch boards shift. Someone had stepped onto it. The weight made the old wood groan softly. Then another step, and another, slow, careful. I felt my throat dry up. My mind kept racing through possibilities. A hunter? A lost hiker? Someone who lived nearby? But the way they moved didn't feel like someone looking for help. It felt like someone watching, someone waiting for the right moment to act. I moved to the bedroom and locked the door, even though I knew the thin wood wouldn't stop anyone determined. I sat on the floor with my back against the wall. The footsteps reached the door to the cabin. Then silence again. A long, steady silence that felt like it was pressing against the walls. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't move. I just sat in the dark, listening. At some point, maybe around dawn, the forest sounds slowly returned. Crickets, birds, wind, whatever had been outside was gone. When the first light filled the cabin through the thin curtains, I stood up on shaky legs and walked to the front door. I opened it slowly and stepped onto the porch. The clearing looked normal, but the ground around the cabin was disturbed. Fresh footprints circled the building, not animal tracks, shoe prints. The pattern looked like someone had walked around again and again, stopping in long pauses facing the windows and the door. I packed my things as fast as I could. I didn't bother cleaning up or checking anything else. I threw everything into my car, turned the engine on, and left the cabin behind without looking back. By the time I finally reached the main road, my hands had only just stopped shaking. I drove straight back to the city, and when I got home, the strange pressure in my chest finally faded. But the fear stayed. To this day, I don't know who was outside the cabin or what they wanted. I just know they were real, patient, and close enough to touch the walls I was hiding behind. And the footsteps were not the kind of thing a tired mind imagines. I heard them. I felt them through the floorboards. They were there. And leaving that cabin when I did was the only reason nothing worse happened. I am sure of that. I never planned to spend a weekend alone in a mountain cabin, but in late October of 2019, I told myself I needed a break from everything. I was 27 at the time, exhausted from work, losing sleep most nights, and convinced that a quiet place away from my phone and city noise would fix my mood. A friend of a friend had a small old cabin in the northern part of Montana, a place he barely used. He said it was safe, basic, and quiet. That was what I thought I wanted. I didn't ask many questions. I just packed a bag, bought a few groceries, and drove 6 hours north into an area I had never visited before. The cabin sat at the edge of a steep valley, surrounded by trees that looked older than anything I had ever seen. The dirt road leading to it was barely a road at all. The cabin itself was small, wooden, and tilted slightly, like years of snow and ice had pushed it a little off balance. It had one room, one small kitchen area, and a short hallway that led to a narrow bathroom. There was no electricity except a weak solar panel that powered a single light bulb above the table. The air smelled like dust, pine sap, and something older, like old fabric that had not been aired out for years. The place wasn't dirty, just aged. Felt like time slowed down the moment I stepped inside. My first day there was boring in the best kind of way. I unpacked, organized my food, and took a long walk around the property. The land behind the cabin sloped downhill with loose rocks and fir trees that blocked most sunlight. I kept hearing cracking sounds deeper in the woods, but told myself they were probably deer or maybe fallen branches shifting under their own weight. When I went back inside, the temperature had dropped a lot faster than I expected. By the time evening hit, the cabin felt cold enough that my breath was visible. I started a fire in the small stove by the wall and tried to read, but I couldn't shake the strange tension in the air, like the cabin was holding its breath. That night, I woke up around 2 a.m. with my heart racing for no reason. The cabin was silent, so silent that the silence itself felt heavy. I lay there trying to calm my breathing, but then I heard something outside slow, steady crunching on the gravel path that led to the front door. At first I thought it was an animal, maybe a bear, since the area had plenty of them. But whatever was stepping on that gravel was too controlled, too slow, like it was placing each step carefully. I held my breath and waited. The crunching stopped right near the front entrance. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. A long minute passed, then another, and eventually I convinced myself it had been nothing. Probably the sound of rocks cooling down after the daytime heat. The mind, especially in a quiet place, fills in blanks with fear. I forced myself to believe that. I fell asleep sometime near dawn. The next morning, I noticed footprints near the front steps. Not boots, not shoes, bare feet, large ones. They were unclear, but still unmistakably human. The prints were slightly blurred, like whoever made them had walked on wet soil before stepping on the dry dirt. At first, I tried to explain them. Maybe they were old. Maybe someone had visited the cabin earlier in the week. Maybe the shape only looked like bare feet. But the soil was disturbed in a way that looked recent, fresh enough that the edges had not yet softened. I didn't want to overreact, so I cleaned around the front area and tried to focus on the things I came here to do: read, rest, and disconnect. But from that point on, I felt watched. Every sound seemed sharper. Every small creak of the cabin felt directed at me. By afternoon, clouds rolled in fast, turning the sky dark and bruised. Strong wind pushed against the cabin walls, and the trees outside bent back and forth like they were trying to shake something off their branches. Around 5 p.m., I found something that made my stomach drop. Behind the cabin, near the slope, someone had placed a small pile of rocks against the wall. They weren't random. They were arranged carefully, stacked 3 high. No animal would do that. I hadn't done it. The rocks were clean, almost too clean, as if someone had washed them before stacking them there. For a long time, I just stared at them, trying to make sense of it. A part of me wanted to grab my keys and leave right then, but the sun was dropping fast and the road out of the mountains was full of sharp turns with no guardrails. Driving tired and panicked in the dark felt like a bad plan. When night came, the cabin felt even colder than the night before. I stayed awake on the bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to listen for anything outside. The wind howled through the trees, scraping branches along the cabin roof. For a while, that was all I heard. Then, sometime after midnight, the footsteps returned. This time, they were even slower, heavy. One step, pause. Another step, longer pause. Then nothing. A long stretch of silence, broken only by the wind. But then something touched the cabin wall right behind my bed. Not a hit, not a scratch, just a soft push, as if someone placed a hand against the wood. It was direct enough that I felt the vibration travel through the frame of the mattress. I froze. The pressure lasted only a second or two, but in that short moment, I felt the kind of fear that makes your whole body turn to ice. When it stopped, I didn't move at all. I stared into the dark room until tears rolled out of my eyes from not blinking enough. When the first hint of daylight came through the window, I got up, grabbed my stuff, and stepped outside. The air smelled metallic, like cold stone. Near the back of the cabin, where the stacked rocks had been, the pile was gone. All the rocks were scattered in a line pointing downhill toward the tree line, spaced evenly apart as if someone had walked and placed each rock one by one. The soil around them was disturbed in a clear path, deep footprints, bare feet again, leading straight into the trees. That was enough for me. I locked the cabin door even though it barely had a working lock, threw my bag into my car, and drove out of there without even checking if I forgot anything. The whole drive downhill my hands were shaking, and I kept checking my mirrors even when there was no reason to. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station 2 hours away, and even then I stayed inside the car for a long time before getting out. In the weeks after, I tried to tell myself that everything I experienced had a rational explanation, that someone else had been wandering near the cabin, maybe a hiker or someone living off the grid. But bare feet in late October? Footprints that deep? A hand pressed against the wall at 2 in the morning? I replayed everything over and over, trying to twist the details into something that made sense, but nothing ever fit perfectly. I never went back to that cabin. I never asked the guy who owned it if he had neighbors or if someone lived nearby. I didn't want to know. What scared me the most wasn't the footsteps or the footprints. It was the feeling, that heavy pressure in the air, the sense that someone had been standing in the dark, only a few inches of wood away from me, completely silent, aware of me long before I ever realized anything was wrong. The ending became clear to me later, after many nights of thinking about it. Whoever was out there was not lost, confused, or passing by. Whoever it was knew the cabin, knew the land, knew someone would eventually come to stay there alone. I had not stumbled into danger by accident. I had walked straight into someone else's territory without knowing it. And the only reason I left unharmed was because whoever had been watching me decided to let me go. And that thought still follows me even now, because if someone like that decides to let you go once, it means they could easily choose not to next time. I never planned to spend a night alone in that cabin. It was the summer of 2014, and I was 26 at the time, tired from work and tired from the noise of city life. A friend of mine told me about a small rented cabin near a quiet lake in northern Idaho. It was cheap, peaceful, and isolated. I felt like that was exactly what I needed. I didn't check reviews or look up the history of the place. I just booked it and packed a few things in my car. Clothes, a flashlight, basic food, and an old sleeping bag I hadn't used in years. The road to the cabin was mostly gravel after the first hour, and tall pine trees covered both sides. The sky looked heavy even though the sun was still up, and I could see the first hints of a storm forming far away. The air smelled cold and sharp, like the lake was close. When I finally reached the place, I saw how isolated it truly was. The nearest house wasn't a house at all, just an old, abandoned shed half collapsed and covered in weeds. The cabin stood on a small patch of cleared land, surrounded by forest that felt too quiet for that time of year. The cabin itself wasn't big. One room for sleeping and eating, one small bathroom, and a porch that creaked more than it should have. The wooden boards looked old but stable enough. Inside, the smell of dust hit me right away. It reminded me of basements where boxes stay untouched for years. I opened the small window above the sink to let the stale air escape. Outside, I could hear faint waves from the lake, which sat only 30 or 40 steps away through a short path of uneven dirt. The first hour there felt normal. I placed my things on the table, tested the small electric heater, and checked the lock on the front door. It barely clicked into place, and I made a mental note that I should push a chair against it later. There was no phone signal the moment I stepped inside, but I expected that. I saw that as part of the break I needed. When evening came, the air turned colder faster than I thought it would. Clouds built overhead, darker and heavier, and I felt the pressure shift. The lake turned rougher, small waves breaking without pattern. I decided to take a walk down to the water before the weather got worse. The path was short but muddy in places. The shore was quiet except for the wind cutting across the surface. No birds, no insects, just movement of water and trees. I remember feeling a strange discomfort then. Nothing supernatural, just a sense that something was off, like the forest was listening too closely. I stayed outside only a few minutes before heading back inside. The light was fading quickly, and the wind grew strong enough to push against the cabin walls. I heated a can of soup and sat on the small wooden chair near the door. The wind made a steady, deep sound as it moved through the trees, and the roof gave small, slow creaks as if adjusting under the pressure. I tried to relax, but the quiet between each sound felt long and heavy. Around 10 p.m., the storm fully arrived. Thunder rolled across the lake, and rain hit the windows hard enough to make the glass shake. The power flickered once, then stabilized. I lay inside my sleeping bag on the thin mattress, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sharp slap of rain on wood. I wasn't scared yet, just uncomfortable. The kind of tension that grows in your chest when you're alone somewhere unfamiliar while nature pushes against the walls. At some point past midnight, I heard something that didn't sound like rain or wind. It was a dull, heavy thump against the porch. Not fast, not repeated, just one heavy impact. I held my breath, waiting for anything else. Nothing happened for maybe 20 seconds. Then I heard another thump, the same weight behind it, the same unsettling slowness. I slowly sat up, trying not to make noise. The wind was still loud, but these sounds were close, almost like someone stepping onto the wooden porch boards. I kept telling myself it could be a branch or something blown by the storm, but the weight of each step didn't match something random. It sounded like pressure from above, like the board sinking slightly under something real. I reached for my flashlight and pointed it toward the window, but the rain covering the glass made it useless. All I saw were streaks of water. My heartbeat felt slow and heavy, like my body was trying to move while refusing at the same time. I stayed still for nearly a full minute. I expected the steps to continue, but they stopped as soon as the rain got heavier. Just when I felt the tension settle a little, I heard a different noise near the back wall of the cabin. A scraping sound, slow, steady, like something dragging across wet wood. Then another, and another. I felt a sharp coldness in my stomach. I wasn't imagining it. Something or someone was out there. I didn't open the door. I didn't look outside. I stayed still and listened. The scraping moved along the wall, then paused, then continued near the small bathroom window. I wanted to believe it was a loose branch, but branches don't move on their own from one wall to another in patterns. The scraping eventually faded after maybe 3 minutes, but those minutes felt stretched and hollow. I didn't sleep at all. I just waited, breathing carefully, holding the flashlight like it would do something if things got worse. The storm kept pounding the cabin until early morning. When the rain finally lightened, I stood up slowly and checked the door. I pushed the chair aside and opened it just enough to look out. The porch was wet, but two clear impressions sat on the boards. Long, thin marks as if someone had stepped there with something sharp underfoot. Not like shoes, but not like an animal either. I checked along the outside wall and found more long scratches, some reaching nearly halfway up the boards. I packed everything fast and left within 10 minutes. I didn't bother cleaning the place or checking the lake again. I drove until I reached a gas station with cell service. Later, I tried researching anything about break-ins or wildlife in that area, but nothing matched what I saw. No animal I've heard of moved the way those sounds moved. No person would wander around a cabin during a storm like that without leaving clearer tracks. I never went back, and to this day, I don't know who or what walked around that cabin. But I know it was real. I know what I heard, and I know what I saw on the wood the next morning. Whatever it was comfortable being out there in the dark, moving quietly, watching the cabin while the storm covered everything else. And the only reason I got to leave without finding out more was because I chose not to open that door. I drove up into the northern woods of Montana during the fall of 2019, thinking a few days alone in a rented cabin would help me clear my head. I had been working long hours for months, barely sleeping, barely eating real meals, and my mind felt worn out in a way that was becoming hard to explain. The cabin sat more than a mile away from the nearest dirt road, tucked behind layers of tall pines and dried brush. The listing online had shown bright summer pictures, sunlight spilling across a wooden deck and a neat little trail running behind it. But when I arrived, the place looked older, quieter, and much more isolated than the photos suggested. The boards along the steps were worn at the corners, almost soft from years of weather, and the windows had a thin layer of dust on the inside, as if no one had touched them for weeks. I carried my bags inside and felt the air shift in that strange way old cabins do, like the whole structure was exhaling around me. The interior smelled faintly of cold wood and something metallic, maybe the old stove. I turned on the small propane heater and watched the flame flicker weakly inside its metal cage. The cabin had just one main room with a short hallway that led to a tiny bedroom and an even smaller bathroom. Everything was simple, plain, and silent. I liked that. I wanted silence. For the first few hours, nothing felt wrong. I unpacked my clothes, stacked my food on the tiny kitchen counter, and walked out to the deck to look at the forest. It was late afternoon, the sun low and orange, cutting long shadows through the trees. The wind was gentle, brushing the tops of the branches so they swayed in slow movements. I thought maybe the trip really would help me reset. I ate a small dinner, wrote some notes in a journal, and went to bed earlier than I expected. The first night, I woke up around 2 a.m. My body felt cold, even though the heater was still running. I lay there for a moment, trying to understand what brought me out of sleep. The silence in the cabin was heavier than before, like the walls were absorbing all sound. I heard a faint thud from outside, then another, slower this time, as if something heavy had been set down on the wooden deck. I held my breath and waited, listening for footsteps, but the sound didn't repeat. After a few minutes, I convinced myself it was a branch or maybe a pine cone hitting the boards. I eventually drifted back to sleep, though my body stayed tense until morning. The next day, I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling. I took a long walk through the woods behind the cabin, following old hunting markers nailed to trees. The air was cool and crisp, and every breath felt sharper and cleaner than what I was used to back home. But whenever I turned around to check the trail behind me, I kept feeling like something had moved just out of sight. I saw no one, heard nothing unusual, and still, something about the silence bothered me. It wasn't peaceful. It was watchful. When I returned to the cabin around noon, I noticed something strange near the edge of the deck. The dirt looked disturbed in a narrow path leading from the tree line toward the steps, as if someone had walked through while I was gone. The prints weren't clear enough to see shape or size, but the line of flattened grass was unmistakable. I stood there for a long moment, scanning the woods, waiting for something to shift, but nothing moved. The wind had even stopped. The whole forest felt like it was holding its breath. I spent the rest of the day inside, writing and checking the windows every so often. As the sun dropped, a sense of heaviness settled over me again. I had never been scared of being alone in the woods before, but something about this place felt different. When night came, I turned on every light in the cabin. I tried reading, then tried writing again, but I couldn't focus. My mind kept drifting to the quiet outside, the dark shapes of the trees, and the memory of those faint prints. I finally went to bed, though sleep didn't come easily. Sometime after midnight, I heard the sound again. Another dull thud on the deck. This time it was closer to the wall, and the cabin seemed to vibrate slightly with the impact. My skin prickled. I stayed still, breathing slow and shallow, hoping whatever was outside would leave. Then came another thud, lighter than the first, like someone had shifted their weight. The boards creaked in a subtle but unmistakable way, the kind of creak made by footsteps. I lay frozen for what felt like an hour. The sound stopped eventually, replaced by the same deep, unnatural silence that had filled the cabin the night before. When morning finally came, I stepped outside with caution. The dirt path looked even more disturbed now. The grass along the edges was bent lower, and a small section of the deck rail had fresh scrapes on it, as if something rough had dragged across it during the night. By the third night, I was exhausted. My nerves were frayed from lack of sleep and constant tension. I left the heater on high, hoping the steady hum would drown out any noise. But sometime around 3 a.m., I woke again, this time not to a sound, but to the sense of movement near the cabin. My pulse hammered in my chest. I sat up and waited. A moment later, the faintest pressure pressed against the wall near the foot of my bed, like someone leaning slowly against the outside boards. I stared at the wall, my heart climbing up into my throat. The pressure stayed for several seconds, then eased away. I heard soft steps moving toward the deck, careful, slow, deliberate. Then the boards creaked again, followed by a long scrape that traveled from one side of the railing to the other. After that, silence. I didn't sleep again. When the first gray light of morning touched the windows, I packed my bags as fast as I could. My hands shook the entire time, and I kept glancing at the windows, half expecting a face to appear or a shadow to break the stillness. I didn't bother cleaning up or checking drawers. I just grabbed everything and stepped outside, feeling the cold morning air hit my skin like a warning. The dirt trail leading from the woods was clearer than ever. This time, the flattened grass stretched all the way to the back corner of the cabin, where the bedroom wall stood. There was no mistaking it. Someone had been standing there in the dark, only inches from where I slept. I didn't look back again. I hiked to my car so fast I nearly tripped over roots and rocks. When I finally reached the road and locked myself inside the car, a strange wave of relief and sickness washed over me at the same time. As I drove away, I didn't see anything in the rearview mirror. Not a person, not an animal, not even a shadow. The woods looked calm, untouched, harmless. But I knew better now. I understood, in a way that left my stomach tight, that someone had been watching that cabin for a long time. Maybe they lived somewhere in those woods. Maybe they had a routine of checking the place when renters came. Maybe they were waiting for people to fall asleep. I didn't know what they wanted, and I didn't want to imagine it any further. What mattered was that I had left before they decided to do more than watch. When I got home later that day, I deleted the listing from my browser history, shut off my phone, and sat in silence for a long time. I could still feel that strange pressure against the wall, that silent lean, as if someone had been testing how close they could get without waking me. I knew I would never go back to a place like that again. The woods weren't peaceful anymore. They held too much that stayed quiet, too much that waited in the dark, studying the walls of a cabin that looked empty but wasn't. And the worst part was the simple truth I kept circling back to. I had been inside that cabin the whole time, thinking I was alone, while someone stood only a few inches away, listening to me breathe through the wall. I left, but whoever they were, they stayed. And the cabin is still there, standing quietly in those endless trees, waiting for the next person who thinks silence means safety. I drove up to the cabin in the middle of October 2016. The place was tucked into a remote valley in northern Montana, a spot I picked because I wanted quiet after months of stress at work. The owner told me it used to belong to some old hunter who stopped coming years ago. From the photos it looked simple. Wooden walls, a tin roof, a small deck facing a line of tall pines. I was 29 at the time, old enough to think I knew how to handle myself alone, but young enough to ignore the small things that should have warned me. The road to the cabin stretched for miles without a single house. The sky felt too wide, the way it feels when you suddenly realize how far you are from anything familiar. When I arrived, the air smelled sharp and cold, and the forest around the cabin looked darker than it should have so early in the afternoon. The cabin itself seemed fine, dusty but not damaged, with a big wood stove in the center and a window facing the woods. I remember feeling relieved, thinking it would be a simple weekend. Just me, silence, and time to clear my head. But things felt off from the first night. I unpacked slowly and walked around the property. The ground behind the cabin sloped down into thick trees, so dense I couldn't see more than a few feet in. The forest floor looked disturbed in places, like someone had dragged something heavy across the dirt recently. I tried to tell myself it was animals. I didn't want to overthink anything. I had come to relax, not get paranoid. The first weird thing happened when I was getting ready to sleep. I was sitting on the edge of the old wooden bed when I heard something out in the trees. It wasn't an animal cry or wind. It was steady, slow, heavy steps. I froze and listened for a long time, counting the sounds. They moved at an unchanging pace, like someone creeping through the dark. I told myself it had to be a deer or maybe an elk, but I knew how those sounded. This was different, heavier, almost deliberate. The steps kept going until they faded deep into the forest. I barely slept, and when I finally drifted off, I woke up again before sunrise with that strange feeling that something was watching me. When I looked out the window, the trees were still and black, but the ground near the edge of the forest had new marks. Thin lines in the dirt, running straight toward the cabin and back again, almost like footprints but long and dragged out. I didn't want to admit something had been close enough to reach the walls. Even inside the cabin, something felt wrong. The air always smelled faintly of damp metal, like rust and wet clothing. Sometimes the floorboards creaked for no reason. Not the usual settling of old wood, but short, sharp creaks like weight shifting from one foot to another. I kept checking behind me without meaning to. I kept glancing at the window even when I tried to read or eat. Silence didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt thick and heavy, like someone else was trying to breathe inside the room with me. By the second night, I started noticing the small details I missed the first day. Scratches on the outside of the door frame, as if something sharp had slid down it. Not deep claw marks, more like someone dragging a piece of metal. The lock on the back door looked newer than the rest of the cabin. A clean silver pad compared to the old rusted hinges. The owner never mentioned that. I kept checking the windows to make sure they were latched, even though I had already checked them twice. Later that evening, while sitting near the stove, I heard something drop onto the roof. Not branches, not pine cones. Something heavier, like a footstep landing softly. Then another, near the far end. I sat still for what felt like an hour, listening to slow movements travel from one side of the roof to the other. The sound stopped right above the bedroom. I didn't dare move. When it finally went silent, my legs felt numb from staying frozen. I tried to convince myself it was a raccoon or some bigger animal, but deep down I knew it wasn't. Animals don't move like that, measured, slow, intentional. I decided I would leave early in the morning, but when I stepped outside to load my bag into the car, I saw something that made my chest tighten. About 20 feet away, right at the tree line, the ground was disturbed again. But this time there were clear depressions, shaped almost like footprints but longer, flatter, like someone stepping carefully, heel first, dragging their toes. 6 prints, each spaced evenly, leading from deep inside the forest to the edge and then stopping. They never turned back. It was as if whatever made them was still out there, hidden behind the trees. That day I stayed inside with the stove running high. I didn't wander around or take pictures. I sat near the window but not too close, watching the woods carefully, trying to catch any sign of movement. The longer I stared, the more I realized the trees weren't the problem. It was the space between them. Dark, narrow gaps where anything could stand without being seen. Night came too quickly. My plan to leave at dawn felt far away, and the hours between sunset and morning stretched out like a punishment. The cabin felt smaller the darker it got. I kept every light on. I kept the fire high, but the sounds came back. Slow steps in the dirt, stopping and starting, circling the cabin. Sometimes they came close enough that I could hear weight shifting on the porch, the faint groan of old boards bending. I pressed my back to the wall, trying to stay quiet. My breathing felt too loud. Every time I thought the steps had faded away, they would return from a different angle, slower each time, like the thing outside had all night to figure me out. Around 3 in the morning, something brushed lightly against the back door. Not a knock, not scratching, just a slow, steady pressure, like someone testing how strong the lock was. For a moment, I thought it would push harder. I thought the wood would crack. My hands shook so badly I had to sit on them. The pressure stayed for a long time, and then, just as slowly, it was gone. I didn't sleep at all. I waited until the faint gray light of morning began to show through the trees. The moment it was bright enough to see the ground clearly, I grabbed my bag and rushed to the car. The cold morning air burned my lungs. I didn't even look back at the cabin. I didn't care about checking out or cleaning up. I just needed to leave. As I drove down the long dirt road, I saw something in the side mirror. A figure standing at the very edge of the tree line. Not close enough to see details, but tall, still watching. I kept my eyes forward and didn't slow down. I didn't want to know if it moved. When I reached the highway, the tension in my chest finally broke, and I felt like I could breathe again. But even now, years later, every time I think about that cabin, I remember the footprints that stopped right at the edge of the trees. I remember the careful steps on the roof. I remember the slow pressure at the door. Most of all, I remember the feeling that whatever was out there wasn't confused or lost or curious. It knew exactly what it was doing, and it wanted me to hear every single step.